Earl Rose was that one person in that horrible moment that said, this is wrong. And what happens? Hand goes to the weapon, pushes him against the wall, said, this is the way it's going to be. And he even tells them that this is in violation of Texas state statute.
Right.
Tells them that, makes them aware of it. He was well aware of the law. He knew that it was wrong. And when they walked out of those doors with the president's body at that moment in time, I think about Dr. Rose watching them kind of vanish with the president's body, thinking, what the hell's going to happen? Well, let me tell you what happened.
Joseph Scott Morgan, I have been looking forward to this podcast for a while now, sir. I'm geeking out this morning. We're going JFK. Huh? It's the 60th. Let's go. And you came prepared. Look at this.
I did come prepared. What can I say? The material in this in the assassination, pertaining to the assassination, is so dense. And the problem is this: when you're talking about dense investigative information, in a case like this where there's so much speculation, you don't know what to believe. You don't know what to believe. You don't know what's valid, because even things that are supposed to be valid sometimes prove to be invalid. When you're talking about trusted sources, and sometimes, you get to studying this stuff and it leaves you, I don't know, there's not a better way to say it, kind of swimmy-headed. I think you're kind of chasing your tail all the way around. You don't know what's real. But what we do know is that we have a very public assassination of a president. And that's where it starts, particularly from my world, which is the medical legal world, as a death investigator, kind of looking at what you have to consider from an evidentiary standpoint. There's all kinds of speculations about that have run their course over the years about what's there and what's missing, what should have been done, and woulda, coulda, shoulda, and for me, all you can really roll with is what there exists at this point in time, and then trying to separate what you believe is fact versus, I'm not going to say fiction, but speculative at best.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that it seems like the more time passes, you would think moves to history a little bit, and you kind of move on with life, which obviously we have, but the more time passes, the more unsettling it gets.
It does, because to say that memories fade is an understatement when it comes to death investigation. They're going to fade. And people die, witnesses die, things get lost in the shuffle, and that is certainly problematic. And that's happened over the course of the years since November of 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was killed. It would be fantastic, I think, on one level, if we could travel back in time and get a do-over, get a mulligan, if you would. But that's not going to happen. So, like I was saying, all that we have, and no pun intended, is all that remains of that life that had been lived, and it ended very quickly and horribly in Dealey Plaza that day. The weird thing about it is that it happened, as it turned out, for the whole world to see. And that's what was quite striking about that event, that with the limited technology that they had back then, that you had this one guy that was standing there with a camera that he would probably take on vacation and film the Grand Canyon with. and it was a celebration for him. I'm talking about Zapruder.
Yep.
Because the president was coming to town. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal for me, man. The president shows up. I want to go. I want to preserve that moment, those images, and he just happened to be in that spot at that moment in time.
Right spot, right time. Yeah, for people who've never seen that video, it'll get demonetized if I show it on here, but you can go right to YouTube, type in Zapruder Film HD. It is the film you've probably seen at some point in your life when they show this, of the car coming down and bop, bop, and everything right after that. But it's crazy how the world lines up, and a guy, like, he even kept most of his steadiness.
He did.
Following the shot basically all the way through.
Yeah, he did. And, years since then, as I worked as a death investigator over the years, there were any number of times where I would have people that would film their own deaths. I had several people that would film their own suicides over the years, and you would have to go back and watch these things. And the reason I'm saying that is the fact that the old adage about the camera not blinking, and the fact that he was able to capture that moment in time where he is still tracking as the limo is moving down the road like this. He never stops. And the fact that it's almost like he didn't necessarily have an awareness of what was going on. He had tunnel vision, and why wouldn't he? It was the president of the United States. It was the first lady who I think that, even Kennedy said a few times when they would go to these, to dinners and whatnot, I know that you're not here for me. You're here to see my lovely wife.
Hey guys, can I ask you a small favor? So in the month of September, if you look at this chart to my right, if you're watching here on YouTube, you'll see that 84% of the watch time that we had on this channel was from people who were not subscribed. And so it's no coincidence that we started to have a big problem getting episodes successfully into the YouTube algorithm throughout September and October, despite the fact that they were performing well by almost every other metric. Frankly, it's because I have been remiss on asking you guys to subscribe to the channel, so that's on me. That said, if you don't mind, please take 1 second, hit that subscribe button here on YouTube so that we can grow this show, get great guests to come in here, and put out more podcasts.
And people from back then, they had this air of celebrity about them that I don't think that people had ever seen in the White House. It was a different time.
Yeah.
And people were dazzled by that. We're kind of numb to it nowadays, I think.
Beginning of TV. I mean, that was probably the number one thing. I mean, part of the reason he was able to pull off that upset victory, besides the mafia stuffing a lot of boxes in Dallas and Chicago, was he had the first televised debate against Nixon on TV. And this was where no one was really trained for TV, and he was a natural.
He was a smooth operator, man.
And it's symbolic because you look at it, this is one of the first iconic images really caught in color and in that way that we've ever had. Even like his trip in Texas for the 2 days he was there before he got killed, with the cameras actually following and capturing what's going on. And you just think about like the symbolism of it, them as like that power couple. I mean, you were in the old studio. You might remember on the wall I had on the far wall all the old school stuff that were examples of things in pop culture, and they were in black and white, and the bottom was in color, and it was the modern day. And on the color one, for one of the 6 panels, I had Jay-Z and Beyonce as like your pop culture power couple.
Right.
But I had Kennedy and his wife as the old school version of it, because they were the first like it thing. And you look at that day, man, the central casting was all there. I mean, her wearing the pink Chanel, she was always dressed in 9, but I mean, have you ever seen something more like horrifyingly perfect when it comes to just the most gruesome event in American history, and yet it's almost like the stage was set in a scary way across the board, including the people who obviously weren't in on it.
Yeah, precisely. And going back to the color of that dress contrasted with the backdrop of kind of the beautiful blue sky. It was a crisp day. But then you reflect back and you think about, they had asked her after this, she had been through this horror, allegedly what she responded with. They asked her, they said, "Do you want to change?" And she said, "No, I want them to see what they've done to my husband."
Yes.
And that pink contrast. And, you know, when you're in the morgue, for instance, and you see there are certain moments in time where you're looking at a specimen in front of you, something that you've removed that has evidentiary value and it's super saturated in blood. And there are these blue drapes that we use in the morgue. And you lay things down on them. And when you snap a shot of that, it's meant to be quite reflective, and you can pick up on all of the contrasting nuances of the specimen that you're taking the photo of. She was that backdrop for that. And, you know, we never got there's that classic image of her on Air Force One where Johnson's being sworn in. She's standing there, you know, in that dress. And that moment in time, it transitioned from Kennedy to Johnson, and a real turning point for the country that, you know, we've never, it defined us, I think, going forward from then, because we were very Eisenhower, leave it to Beaver kind of world, where it was, we thought that there was something better, that you were absent. And this is a post-World War II generation that had gone through the horrors of war, but there was kind of this hope. And then all of a sudden, buddy, it just, after that, it just kind of began to go downhill, I think, with our perception. We became much more cynical, and we've continued to be cynical. And I think a lot of this can be traced back to that moment in time.
Absolutely. And then you look at what happened in the 60s. The Beatles flew across here, like 4 months later or something like that?
Yeah.
And then you have the whole hippie era. Vietnam obviously kicked off. That's a little part of the conspiracy here, too. I mean, it's interesting. It is like, it's exactly like you said. It's like turning the page.
It is. And I'm glad you mentioned this word conspiracy, because that's, and I think that people have kind of looked at these two words that have entered our lexicon since that period of time. They're saying, many say that it was the Kennedy assassination that brought this idea of there being a conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist.
Well, used as a pejorative term.
Yeah. And for many years it certainly has been. Now I think that many people, as you know, more information and data has been, you know, kind of leaked or seeped out over the years. Some people are having second thoughts about, well, maybe it wasn't so. Maybe it wasn't as they have said that it was. That it wasn't as. I don't know. That the truth was that what we were seeing was not necessarily what was truly going on, and I think that's part of the darkness of it. But reflectively, you know, before you asked me to come up and talk about this topic, and thank you for having me back. It means the world to me.
Oh, thank you for being here. Your conversation with me was one of my favorites I ever did.
I spent some time thinking about what I would say to you, and now I'm speaking to you as a forensic scientist and a professor, not so much as an old death investigator that had you know, baggage that I'm dragging along. And reflectively, I began thinking about other political assassinations, and I think that the one that stands out for me is actually involving the first autopsy that we have a record of, that was recorded. And of course, that's the autopsy of Julius Caesar, going back all those years. And
Let's go.
there are many parallels here, I think. And if we go down the rabbit hole relative to how some people might say in society, our betters that are behind these conspiracies that could have the ability to engineer something at this scale. Many people have held on to this idea that many of those people are rooted with a background where they would have been afforded educations where they could have studied the classics over the years. There would have been an awareness of Julius Caesar, and even beyond the idea of what Shakespeare had put forth, et tu, Brute.
Didn't he get murked like right outside Piazza Navona?
Yeah,
in Rome?
It's up on the portico, and of course he was set upon by senators, and it was done in a public arena for everyone to see within the Senate at that point in time. And his personal physician actually did the autopsy and recorded it, which is pretty amazing to me when you think back. I think it was 44. What was it? 44 A.D. When he died. Was it 44 A.D.? I can't recall off the top of my head. I want to make sure that I have that right. 44 B.C. Wow. So 44 B.C.
We lost Caesar and Jesus like real fast.
Yeah, I know. This preceded Christ. But, following that kind of train of thought, you've got this man who was beloved by the people. That was perception. He had made reforms within Rome. Senate wasn't happy about it. Those that are in power are not happy about it. And he's an interesting character, to say the very least. But when he was set upon by these people within this arena, and it was demonstrated for everyone that was present, there were a collection of servants, slaves, not to mention sitting senators that were in this environment. It was done as a demonstration of that he's evil, we're going to put an end to him. And in documenting the autopsy, he went over Caesar's body with a fine-tooth comb. For this time, it's quite amazing because he documented all of these injuries. I think that it was a total of 26 stab wounds. They really went after his face. They tried to mutilate his groin. He was attacked in this area. It was almost an emasculation type of thing.
Did they start in the back, though?
Well, yeah, and that's where we get this term backstabbing.
Back. Yeah.
And interestingly enough, the injury that he sustained just below his left scapula is probably the one that actually killed him, so his left shoulder blade. And when it entered his body, what the physician opined was that he clipped the lung, and he may, it's real unclear, he may have clipped the aorta, which is the major vessel coming off of the heart. And so Caesar didn't die immediately. He laid there, and it is said, and this was written probably 200 years after the fact by a historian, that he pulled his toga up over his face and kind of laid there, and he's blood-soaked at this point in time. But what's really amazing is this. I think that the conspirators in this case, these conspirators that conspired to do this, thought that it was going to be received in this manner in which people would be elated and joyful.
That he's gone.
That he's gone, yeah, absolutely. But he did something interesting, and this is one of those moments in time where our history that we're in right now kind of intersects with that moment in time from a forensic standpoint. After the physician did the autopsy on Caesar's remains, he went back and created a wax effigy. It was the first time that you ever have a multi-dimensional rendering of a human being in order to demonstrate injuries. And the record shows from back then that they placed it on, and it's written this way, that they placed it on a spinning mechanical device. In other words, they could spin it around for the whole crowd to see. And he displayed all of these injuries on Caesar's body, and they had his toga there, blood saturated. And the crowd is said to have gasped and cried that they couldn't bear the sight of this any longer. And it was demonstrative of what had happened. And guess where he did this display? A place called the Forum. And guess what the root of what we do in my field is? Forensics. And it originates from that term.
No.
Yeah. So to present something in a forensic environment, it's a place where you go to debate. You take science, you take it to court, you open up for debate in that environment, you discuss, people are on trial, you present the scientific evidence. And that's what the word forensic is rooted in. It comes from the forum, the ability to speak.
I never knew that. That's
and
wild.
So it's a pretty amazing thing. But here's what I was thinking. If you go down the rabbit hole with all the conspiratorial stuff, these people that would have had the ability to create some kind of wide-ranging conspiracy, they would have been aware perhaps of what happened in Rome following Caesar's
the JFK
death.
people, you're saying.
Yeah. And what happened in Rome? It was one of the most bloody conflicts that they ever had. They had all-out civil war, and it went on for a long time.
And you think the people who planned JFK would have properly studied this?
Well, they would have at
Because that
least,
seems like that'd be the opposite.
They would have at least had an awareness. They knew that if that were the case, they would know that they couldn't go out and make a big deal out of it. They're not going to make the same mistakes that the senators would have made back then, assuming that everybody would want this, because if they did, all hell would rain down. So if that's the way that people want to think, if you continue that line of logic moving out like that, you begin to think, I wonder if that's why all these things have been hidden. Because if you truly knew what had happened, perhaps, there would be so much anger. There would be so much, there would be a calling for blood, I think, if people knew. And that's the way I was thinking about it. Now, whether or not that's accurate or not, I have no idea.
Are you sick of the coffee jitters from drinking it too many days in a row? How about that dreaded afternoon crash? Well, then listen up, because I have an amazing on-the-go drink for you to try. Mud water. Mud water is a coffee alternative containing 4 adaptogenic mushrooms. Big words because they're really cool. With only a fraction of the caffeine of a cup of coffee, you're still going to get that all-day energy without the jitters or the crash. And by the way, each ingredient was added for a very specific purpose. You got cacao and chai for a hint of caffeine and a tasty hot chocolate-like flavor, cordyceps to promote natural energy, and both chaga and reishi to support a healthy immune system. All you got to do is take a scoop of mud water powder, drop it into hot water, stir, and get on with your day. Personally, I love how you can drink mud water straight up or mix it into your favorite smoothie. Gotta have options, baby. So what I need you to do is go down and click the mud water link in my description, and at checkout, use promo code Julian to get 15% off the best coffee alternative you'll ever find. Once again, that's promo code Julian, Julian, at checkout to get 15% off your own mud water today. And by the way, they're going to throw in a free frother as well. Everybody wins. Now let's get back to the show.
I think that the arrogance, obviously you have to be arrogant to try to take out like the leader of the free world, the leader of your country, leader of anything. But the arrogance after the fact and immediately after the fact in the complete inattention to some of the most basic details that you, if it's a ton of people in on this conspiracy, they're supposed to be smart in the government, that you'd think they would have had buttoned up a little better. The arrogance there is never lost on me, because, you know, when you have the timeline I noticed in the front of this thick binder right here of all this research you've done over the years. So I'm gonna have you go through that in a minute to set the stage. But when you look at all the almost like comical things that happened in the moments and hours right after this thing, we are talking about a dead United States president who was not afforded some of the most basic, or his family, I should say, because he's gone, was not afforded some of the most basic rights of, I guess, like chain of possession of the body and actual what happened here in the autopsies rather than like a plotted out autopsy with certain people who shouldn't even be in the room running it. Like the mess that this was is stunning to me, and it makes the whole, I mean, you're just talking about like the conspiracy angle there and how that term got used. We know that that's a term that was pushed into the lexicon. It had been around, I believe, but it was pushed into the lexicon after this because anyone who would dare question this, which anyone with half a brain who looked at it should have, you wanted to, the people in charge wanted to make sure that they were kind of labeled so that, you know, they were kind of cast off and people didn't ask questions about this. And yet here we are, and we still don't even have all these documents released, and people know what happened in a lot of ways, maybe not exactly, but they have an idea of what may have been the greater move here, and yet we still technically don't have answers 60 years later. Blows my mind.
Well, yeah, and the idea, you used the term pejorative a few moments ago, and yeah, I mean, they want to label somebody as a nut job, and that's been going on for years and years, and automatically the intent obviously is to shut people up, you know, because they're going to drag you off to the loony bin or discredit you, or even worse, ruin your life in some way. And so, yeah, that's the way that for many people, I think, that were involved in all of this, is kind of how it was framed out. But, you know, President Kennedy, when we begin to discuss or think about how his remains were treated, more consideration is given in the death of a prisoner.
I was going to say a crackhead.
Yeah, than was given to the President of the United States. Because, yeah, he was a father to his children. He was a husband to his wife, but he was our president. He was our president, elected by the people. And the fact that, and there's so many examples of how dismissive the people in charge were relative to the remains. And, you know, and let me kind of back to this idea of a prisoner. Let's just say, for instance, if someone dies in custody, and I've participated in a number of autopsies involving, you know, in custody deaths. I've actually participated in the autopsy of individuals that have died as a result of lethal injection. The examination that is conducted on those individuals where you have a known cause of death is so extensive, everything ranging from full body x-rays to a dissection that if I went into it right now, I don't think that most people would believe that we do this in the morgue, where you're not just opening the body well, first off, you're not just doing an external examination on the body and photographing the body very thoroughly, but you're also doing not just an internal examination anteriorly, which means opening the chest and opening the head. You literally flip the person over and you open their back. You cut down the backs of their arms. You open up the palms of their hands. You cut down the backs of their legs. Did you know you even dissect the soles of their feet? And that's to see if they've been injured in any way at the hands of those individuals that are in charge of them.
How do they put this back together?
Generally, you don't. You allow the mortician to do it. But that's something that's something that is common practice for a prisoner. But yet the Kennedy autopsy was not even a complete autopsy.
No.
It was what's referred to as a limited dissection, which in and of itself is striking because it is at its root. John F. Kennedy's death was a homicide. When you distill it down, it's as basic as it gets. We've got 5 manners of death: homicide, suicide, accidental, natural, and undetermined. You don't have a 6th choice. It's a homicide. That's simply what it was. And up until, I don't know, I guess it was a year? It was 2 years after the president was assassinated, was murdered in public. There was no law in the books that made it illegal to kill a president.
What?
Yeah, at the federal level. And so Congress enacted a law, I think it was in 1965.
But hold on. Someone murdering another human being, because regardless of his title, he's an American citizen.
There was not something that went specifically to the President of the United States occupying that spot at the federal level. That didn't happen until 1965. That's why it's so important to understand contextually what happened in Dallas, Texas that day. This was a homicide of an individual who occupied the space within Dallas County, Texas, in the city of Dallas. It was a homicide. I don't know how many other homicides they had that week, but I tell you this, if they had, they would have been taken to the morgue. They would have been taken to the autopsy suite, and a truly board-certified forensic pathologist would have done their autopsy, and his name was Dr. Earl Rose. Mm-hmm. And he would have done that autopsy, highly qualified, highly respected, but not in the case of Kennedy.
Was he the guy who and this has been shown in movies and stuff, I believe this was actually something that happened, who was like, you can't take that body, state of Texas law says it must remain here, and they're like, fuck you, and they took the body on the plane? That was him?
Yeah, and I'll give you one better than that.
Okay.
Dr. Rose was officed just outside the trauma room.
Oh, so he's like there when his body...
Parkland.
Oh, my God.
He had an office there, and it's fascinating. He's actually a pretty fascinating character. He was the first person that truly was a medical examiner for Dallas. He had kind of come in and established himself in that role, which is fascinating to me, that he would be present. He was officed there or had a space there. And so when everything happened, he was kind of in the background, okay? And when it was called, when he was actually pronounced dead, he being our president, Dr. Rose was Johnny on the spot. He understood the complexity of this case because he's a forensic pathologist. This is bread and butter. This is what he has been trained to do, Julian.
Yeah.
And he's physically there. Just consider this for a moment, all right, if you will. I can't think of any major hospital in the United States right now, I might be wrong, where you have a representative of your local medical legal community that is actually officed just outside of the primary trauma center for that metropolitan area. I mean, where they're physically in the structure. He's there.
Yeah, that's crazy.
He's right there. And that's why I think that when he saw what was happening, his mind is going into overdrive at this point in time, because it's not just that the body is being touched by all of these people that have no business putting their hands on the remains, but he's thinking about considerations like clothing. Where's the clothing? What did they do to the clothing? Was the clothing actually, did they take a great big pair of scissors and run down the trousers and cut the jacket off and cut the shirt off? And did they just take it and kind of bundle it up or wad it up and throw it in the trash bin right there? Because he's thinking about that. He knows that there's potential for evidence to be contained in all of that. And he's seeing this being played out before him. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that, he comes across, or what people have said, kind of a mild-mannered guy. He's from the upper Midwest. I think he's actually from Iowa originally. But imagine this. You're witnessing all of this. This is what you do for a living. And you have the president's body, who at that moment in time, as cold as it sounds, is the biggest piece of evidence you have in this homicide case. It's literally about to be wheeled out of the door to be removed from your control. And you're the one, he's thinking, well, I've got to sign this death certificate because it would fall to him. This is a homicide. This is not something that the president's personal physician would sign, even though he did sign one, which is one of the biggest loads of garbage in this whole thing. They had 2 death certificates that were generated. This falls to the medical legal authority to actually render a death certificate and sign it after an examination has been facilitated. And just at a basic bureaucratic standpoint, a health department will not process a death certificate that is signed by a private physician that is trauma related. Okay. So I don't care if you've been in a hospital for, and this is the way it works now. If you've been in the hospital for, I don't know, for a gunshot wound and you've been in a coma for however many months and you die, that's still a coroner case. It doesn't matter. And in this sense, this is an acute event that you're talking about here. This just happened. You can still smell the blood in the treatment room. But yet, here the body is going down the hallway. I understand why he would want to try to stop them. But from what has been stated over the years, I've heard people say everything from he was shouted at to he was pushed against the wall with their hands on their weapons. I don't know about you. I know that you've really interviewed some pretty intense people over the years, special operations people. I think that even for them in this situation, if you're faced with the full fury of law enforcement authorities, specifically the Secret Service, are you going to be big enough to stand up to them and say, no, we're talking about a physician. This guy is like a scientist. And he said that he finally just let them go because he didn't want to create any more of a disturbance. I guess maybe he thought, well, maybe the DA is going to hop in here and
they got this under control.
Yeah, they're going to interdict this thing. But the next thing you know, they're off to Love Field.
Yeah.
And they're flying out, man, heading out.
So here's a good question to ask. When you you laid out what would happen if you got a prisoner's body or something, but let's paint a homicide.
Yeah, sure.
Something similar. Because you work directly in the coroner's office with the coroner in the autopsy room doing these with him, and you were at the scene before.
Right.
So you get to the scene of the crime. The body is there. It hasn't been touched. It's got the chalk around it, the detectives or whatever. In this case, he was taken in a hospital. So let's stay with the crime scene one, though. You get to the scene of the crime. What are all the steps that happen before that body is in the coroner's hands in the autopsy room?
Are you talking about in a general sense, or are you talking about in the JFK sense?
In a general sense.
In a general sense, first off, if you're talking about the scene and the scene alone, the scene is completely locked down and secured. And there is a barrier that's put up. Either it is a literal barrier or it's tape. You're going to post security around the perimeter of it once you've established where this thing is. And it's locked down for as long as I, by God, want it locked down.
Who's responsible for, when they finally do take it, physically putting the body into the body bag?
Yeah, that's going to be either the ME or the coroner representative.
Okay.
And I've worked in both systems. So in many states, I think that some people don't have an awareness of this. If there is a dead body at the scene, and it's going to vary from state to state, but I've trained coroners all over the United States. If there is a deceased at the scene, the coroner is actually in control of the scene. Now, you don't make a big deal out of it because you don't want to go toe-to-toe with the cops over anything. You try to get along because you're with people, you're with these people all the time. But most of the time, the police will say to the coroner, the medical examiner, have you got everything you need at this point, Doc? Do you have everything under control? And it's at that point in time that you'll come to an agreement as to whether or not the body is going to be removed from the scene at that moment in time. And you have to take very specific steps in order to facilitate that. For one, you don't want to bespoil anything that's laying about the scene. Remove it from the context of the scene if there's more to be processed there. So it's at that point in time that you take control of the body. The body is then removed from the scene and it's taken back to whatever the medical legal facility is, whether it's at a local funeral home, which in rural areas, that's what happens because sometimes funeral directors are the local coroner. I know, exactly, right? Or if you're talking about, in the case of Jersey,
we got a few of those.
No, you have a medical examiner system. And
that's what I meant. We got a few of those.
Yeah, you've got a state medical examiner's office, and that's where the body would go. and you have all of the processing that's going to take place with that body. And many times the police will come to the morgue and aid in the processing of that body, photography for their purposes, collection of certain types of evidence, whether it's trace evidence or perhaps a projectile that's been removed from the body. So you have this kind of coexistence with law enforcement and medical legal. We try to get along as best we can.
And we've updated that obviously since this has happened, back in the early 60s. But I would imagine, the way I've understood in the past, correct me if I'm wrong, the system of checks and balances there was already well in place for your regular homicide back then.
Yes, it was. And I have very little patience with people that specifically to JFK, and I've heard other people say this. I have very little patience with them when they say things, well, they weren't as sophisticated as we are now relative. Let me tell you something about sophistication. This is the same generation that was 5 years away from putting a man on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Or 5, 6.
Yeah, 5 years.
5 years away from putting a man on the moon. Let me repeat that. So the leader of the free world is murdered in daylight like this, and you can't handle this situation any better than it has been handled. It was a complete and total failure. You've only got a few choices here. Either you're incompetent, you don't care, or there's something more sinister going on.
Yeah.
And so that's the way I've kind of always viewed this, because I got to tell you, if remains were treated like the president's remains were treated, if put it in today's context, you'd be out in your ear. You'd be on the unemployment line. As a matter of fact, some people might be questioned by the district attorney because it almost gets over into a criminal act. It all depends on if there's intent there to, mask something or to try to cover something up. And, and there are cases that happen like that. I'm not going to say every day, but with some frequency. But you have these little demonstrations throughout this entire timeline with the president's body and how the remains were treated, how they were examined, that it was just a mass failure all the way along. Mm. So you have to ask yourself that question. Was everybody involved in this set of circumstances? Many people will say, let's look at it this way. Many people will say, and I think that it's more salacious to say this, was everybody in on the conspiracy? I like to ask, was everybody in on the stupidity? Mm. Because that's what it comes down to, because you have a lot of ignorance going on here. And maybe ignorance isn't the right word because that implies you haven't been taught. These people have been taught, and they have an understanding, at least at a base level, that evidence has value, that bodies have value, that we've got to go out and secure the scene. But you've got people running around, like it's, I don't know, Keystone Cops. It's nonsense.
Well, can we start with that timeline I alluded to a little bit ago? Because you have it written down minute to minute. And to be clear, when we originally talked about you coming in, mm-hmm. you had been working with a major network mm-hmm. on investigating the scene for a big special on the 60th anniversary, which you did. You did the whole thing. We're not going to say what network, and we're not going to say what other people were involved. But due to some other people outside of the network, it looks like that is not going to air. So we are essentially getting the exclusive here today on the work you did with us. I'm very happy to see that. But for people out there who, everyone's familiar with the case, obviously, but there's all kinds of moving details in this. For people out there, can we just bring this scene to life right now, and then we'll start dissecting and go through what you found?
Yeah, sure. So you're asking me for a dramatic reading?
whatever floats your boat.
Yeah. Let's kind of start off with. We're not going to go back as far as arriving at Love Field and all these sorts of things, but let's just go through kind of the sequencing when we begin to think about November 22nd, 1963, and it literally picks up at about 12:29 p.m. That's when they believe the first shot was fired. And then at 12:30 p.m., and this is per the record, that the second and third shots were fired. At 12:35 p.m., the presidential limo arrives at the hospital, which was Parkland, and JFK is brought into the trauma room.
Quick question
Yep.
on that. I mean, he had his head blown off on
He did.
TV. Yet they always say like he wasn't declared dead for. You're going to get to that in the
No,
timeline.
no, please go ahead.
But wasn't he dead in the car?
Yeah, I was having this discussion with my wife the other day. She was saying, was it the president? The president was gone when he arrived at Parkland, and they have to put forth they have to go to great lengths to put forth as good a try as they can at heroic measures. You're talking about the president of the United States. And listen, the people at Parkland that were in that trauma center, they were vested. They wanted him to live.
Yeah.
And they had not lost hope. There was nothing sinister about the actions that they took. They did what you would expect at that particular time any trauma room to do. As a matter of fact, they went so far as to, and this goes to another topic here. Parkland's a teaching hospital. Many people forget that. So you've got residents that are there, and you've got these really esteemed professorial types that are there that are teaching young doctors. So when the president arrived there, the balloon goes up unit wide at this place. So if they need,
And this is at 12:35.
yeah. So he rolled through the door at 12:35, but in that time, between the time he arrived and the time he was pronounced dead, there were a number of people that kind of materialized in the treatment area. And I think it's important to understand that you had neurosurgeons that were there that had come down, because they're thinking about, are we going to get him? Is there any way we're going to be able to save him? Does he have like some kind of agonal respiration where his chest is rising and falling? We think about the primal brain controlling our ability to respire and our heart beating and all. Was he doing that unassisted? If there's a chance, we've got to get a neurosurgical consult. So they want these people in there as well. So you've got eyes on. You got the emergency room physicians. You've got the nursing staff that's working feverishly. They're probably doing chest compressions. They're running what's called a code. They're trying to bring him back. And then you have these other medical professionals that are in there, and they're seeing things. You're talking about neurosurgeons that are there in that environment. They're seeing anatomical landmarks. They're seeing his exposed brain, according to many of them, all the while, and they're processing this. And for that instant, they take a snapshot in their brain, in their mind's eye. They take a snapshot of what they're seeing, because for them, in this moment in time, it's not that, oh my God, this is the president of the United States. It's, how do I break this down professionally, and what's the plan of attack here to try to salvage this man's life? Yeah, I would imagine. So? Yeah, I think that for a lot of these folks that, they have the ability to kind of disconnect on one level. I mean, once you've got blood on you at that point in time, I think, and, you're doing the examination and people are working feverishly, it's a patient at that point in time. He's a patient at that point in time. And now the person running the code would probably have an awareness. They would know that it's the president, but the code didn't last a long time. It was, he was actually pronounced dead. He rolled through the door at 3:35.
12:35?
At 12:35. And he was pronounced dead at 12:57. So that's not a lot of elapsed time. The ride where they go under the viaduct, and they've got their foot on the floor, the Secret Service limo driver, straight shot there. They roll right into the ambulance bay. They pull in, they pull directly in like you're parking your car. If no one's ever seen the images there, and that's another thing I'd have to make a comment on here. But yeah.
Also, I'm just remembering you have Governor Connally in the car too, who's been hit with bullets.
He has been hit, and
so they just leave him in the car for a minute.
No, they would have extricated him as well. He's going to go to a separate trauma room because he's
got like the janitor in there working on him.
No, he's the governor, and he has got significant injuries that are potentially life-threatening. He's blown out one of his ribs as a result of this. It's clipped a lung at this point in time.
Magic bullet did it.
Yeah, and we'll get into that some. But yeah, I mean, this man's and he's not a young guy. And so the older you get, obviously, the more trauma you sustain. Right. There's a higher probability, that you're going to, take the leap off the mortal coil here. So they're having to do heroics with him, not to the same level as somebody with an open gunshot wound to the head. But still, they would have thrown resources at him. And as you can imagine, it's totally chaos, and it's very chaotic. And I've often wondered about this with Governor Connally. Obviously, the Secret Service is there protecting the president, okay? And I've often wondered, what type of security did Governor Connally have at that moment in time? Did he have Texas Rangers that took care of him? Or was it state police? Where were they? Were they around this area? Because, and my mind always goes to the coroner, the medical examiner, because I'm thinking when this is going on with Dr. Rose, Earl Rose later on, I'm thinking, were there state police officers there that were part of a team that was assigned to Governor Connally, or had they said, well, we've got the Secret Service today, you boys go grab a cup of coffee. We're not going to be in need of your services. And I can't imagine that, but maybe that's what happened because, I've always thought, why didn't they step in and interdict the situation? Of course, they're focused on the governor's personal security. They probably wouldn't even have had an awareness that, people are about to take the president's body to Love Field, and they're going to depart as soon as they possibly can. And don't forget this. Vice President Johnson's entourage soon came in as well. Oh, yeah. He's with Lady Bird. They show up. And he's got this, they talk about his pallor, that he's kind of flushed, pallor. He's ashen white, and he's going in there because at that moment in time, they've stated that they didn't know what was happening. That people in the immediate circle, they thought that Johnson might be killed, and it's my understanding they had to remove him through a separate exit in the hospital because they were worried for his personal safety. You're talking about the next president. So they have to get him back to Love Field as well.
He was in the room where they were working on him?
I don't know that. I know that he was removed down the hallway at some point in time. And the big thing I've always heard about him specifically was that they were very concerned that some great harm could come to him, and they wanted to prevent that.
Got it.
And I think that they wanted to go wheels up as soon as they could at Love Field. Which again, I don't know how that necessarily plays into the decision that they made with the president's remains. Oh, we're all heading back, so let's take the president's remains with us, which was amazing to me, and a decision that was. I know I'm getting away from the timeline, but I think it's very important to understand.
It's my fault. I'm going to bring it back.
No. It's for several questions are kind of asked the first time of Jackie Kennedy at this moment in time. She is saying that she wants his body removed from Dallas. And I know why she would. Okay. I completely understand. All right. She probably wants him to be with her. She wants to get him out of there. But let's just put it in modern context. If this was one of our loved ones, and I've dealt with a lot of homicides over the years where families don't want us to take bodies, it's a conversation you have to have.
Yes.
They failed to have that conversation. Either that, or the more sinister thing is, we probably don't want to do this here. We probably want to go ahead and get him back to Washington, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. You know,
yeah, like she's going to know the chain of commands at that point, you know?
Not only that, but, you know, grieving people, particularly when they're in this kind of shocky state, can be more easily manipulated than anybody out there. They're like little lambs. And they're shocked, first off, and many times they don't know what to do. I've actually dealt with families after I've notified them over the years where they go into a state of almost catatonia. You know, you can't get them to respond, you know, like this. So she, you know, she's probably going to be amenable to anything that they want. And, you know, when you see that still image of her when Johnson's being sworn in, she's got that 1,000-yard stare, man. You know, as well she should have.
Did you see that movie in 2016, Jackie?
I did not.
Natalie Portman?
No, I did not.
Dude, Natalie Portman nailed that.
No
I mean,
kidding.
It's about, you know, the day and week following his death. And like, you know, and that's just a movie. Obviously, it's a dramatization. But, you know, when you hear the accounts of what she was like and exactly what you just said, that 1,000-yard stare, and, you know, like you're also saying, she's in grieving. You know, this is it's not just the president; it's her husband.
It is
her
husband,
like that's Natalie Portman fucking nailed that. I mean, it's like scary how good it was.
Well, I know that she looked like her. I saw the still images from the movie.
She did kind of look like her a little bit.
Yeah, she did. And one other thing about Jackie also and this is very cold, but this is reality. You're talking about a homicide investigation. She's an essential witness.
Yeah.
A very intimate witness because, you know, they've made a lot over what some of the last words that were exchanged with the president prior to him being shot. And I think that it came from the First Lady of Texas, and she made some kind of remark. You can't say they don't love you here in Dallas or whatever it was in Texas or whatever that remark was. And it was a second later and the world explodes. What was the conversation between him and his wife like? And going back to if we were working this as a homicide, as traumatized as people are that go through this, that are eyewitnesses to events, guess what? I'd be taking a statement from his wife. Anybody would. You would want to separate her out. I know it's a tough time, but did he say anything to you prior to this? You know, she's I think that, you know, people, you know, she had views on things. She's not some Steppert wife that's there. You know, she is actually a real person that had real feelings about her husband. They would have had conversations that were out of earshot. Had he said anything to you at that point in time? And I'm not interested in what the Secret Service or the FBI's interpretation of that is. I want to know what would a Dallas homicide detective have elicited from her at that moment in time if they were able to interview her specifically while it was fresh, not after her memory begins to get layered over a period of time. Again, going back to this idea that if this was appropriately worked from Jump Street, might have a different outcome.
Yeah, I have so many questions on that. We're going to come back to it, though, because my dumbass keeps on interrupting you with this, with questions with this timeline. But I want to go through the timeline because we are going to come back. We're going to break down the actual scene later. We're going to go through the magic bullet bullshit and all that. You also are a New Orleans kid.
Yeah.
And this case has central tenants in New Orleans. You know a lot about that. So we're gonna get through a lot today, people. But I just want to make sure you get through this. We left off at 12:56. He got there at 12:35. He was shot at 12:29. First shot, second shot 12:30. Departs down the highway by 12:35. He's at the hospital. They triage him. They triage Governor Connally somewhere in there, probably in like with the janitor, like I said. And then 12:57. He's declared dead in the room. Now what?
Yeah, so if you jump ahead just under an hour after the president is pronounced dead, Lee Harvey Oswald is found in the theater. That was like at 1:40 p.m. So he's found in the theater watching a movie, and there's a tussle with him. He's got a weapon on him. He pulls a weapon out, and the police begin to beat his ass there in the theater seats. And, and he bears evidence of that, when you see those images of him back at the, and he makes some comment, some offhanded comment. Yeah, a police officer did this to me,
Old Texas cop, old school beat down there, huh?
Well, you have to understand what they were looking for him for. It wasn't necessarily, it had nothing to do with the president at that moment in time. He was alleged to have killed one of their own.
That's right.
Yeah, so
yes.
he was, Officer Tibbets. I'll make sure I got that right.
We'll look it up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Had been shot down after he sees a guy that's fitting this suspect's description on the side of the road in this kind of residential area. And Lee Harvey Oswald at that moment in time produces this pistol. It was a revolver, 38 caliber revolver. And he winds up just riddling the police officer with bullets, and then he bolts after that period of time. Now, the description had gone out, and if I'm not mistaken, it was a neighbor that had witnessed this. They wind up calling in to say that you've got a police officer that's down out here. And so that's when the search starts for Lee Harvey Oswald.
Real quick, to all my Discord people out there, the Julian Dorey Discord is officially live. I put the link down in the description below. So go hit that, join the community, and say what's up. There's all kinds of features in there, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. Let's get it popping.
And when you look at Oliver Stone's investigations of this over the years, and I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, he even had some sort of portrayal of this in the movie JFK from '91. But some of the guys who have worked with him as well, if I'm remembering this correctly as well, there is an argument there that because of the line of shot of the quote-unquote witnesses of who saw Oswald shoot the cop, that it may not have been Oswald doing that. We do know that they had impersonators of him. But
yeah, I've heard that as well. And I think that even goes back to the appearance of, I think people talk about the appearance of Oswald, who's supposed to be Oswald at in Mexico City, at the consulate down there. So you've had those types of things that have been running wild all of these years as well. I think in Stone's movie, if I'm not mistaken, I think he actually portrays Oswald as shooting the officer. He's got the character. It's played by Gary Oldman.
Yes.
And, there's points of view, there's perspectives on everything that you have. If you've got somebody sitting on the front porch that's doing something, maybe somebody that's looking out the window, you don't know what their accounts are going to be based upon everything from a screen in between them, a closed window, their ability to see. Are they wearing glasses or not wearing glasses? Are they drinking? There's any number of things, daylight, lighting, those sorts of things. And are they scared? If you hear gunshots, I'm being older now, I'm not going to stick my head out of the window. I'm diving for cover. I value my life too much at this point in time. But, when you're peeping over, are you seeing, what exactly are you seeing? Do you actually get a good look at this person? So, so you've got this officer that is bleeding out, that's dead in the street right there. And they're looking for this guy. Well, he's seen running into the theater. He sits down and, call goes out. They found him there. And that's when, they rush in, they grab him.
12:40.
We're at 1:40 at this point in time. And so
1:40. I'm sorry. He died at 12:57. That's right.
At 2 p.m., mark this time. That's when the argument occurs over the body in the emergency room. So the president has been pronounced dead at 12:57. Now, you would have, after the pronouncement, last rites would have been administered. There was a priest that showed up to do last rites. President's
wife. Do we know who that priest was?
Not off the top of my head.
Are you sure he was a priest? Man, I gotta ask these.
I have no idea.
Make me stop. I'm sorry. Keep going.
I don't know. Can we get the diocese on the phone and
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
have them
Keep
dig
going.
back through the records?
I can't
But
help
yeah,
myself.
I mean, you can't. No stone can remain unturned. So the priest is administering last rites. You have an opportunity for whoever in the entourage is going to take a look at the body. Now, did Jackie go in and view his body at that moment in time? Did she see his body? Did she spend time with the body at that moment in time? That's kind of a common practice and was a common practice back then. I've been in a position where when we have a complicated homicide, and again, this is very cold, we don't allow families anywhere near the body after that, even after pronouncement. We try to get the body out of the facility as soon as possible because the body is your central point of evidence at that point in time. So how much time was she allowed to spend in there? Did she spend time there with the body? So that brings us all the way up to 2 p.m. They've got the president's body on a gurney at this point in time, and they want to get the body out of the door. I think they'd already casketed the body as well in one of these transportation caskets. So that would have been acquired, and that's like it looks almost like a steel casket or almost like aircraft aluminum that these things are in. They used them for the troops for years and years. I think that they still do. So his body would have been casketed. It would have been removed from that location and taken to Love Field. Body arrives. There's an argument, and this is kind of interesting. There's an argument over the body that occurs at 2 p.m. So at 2:07, the body leaves the hospital. It arrives at Love Field at 2:38.
That's the air hangar.
Yeah, that's that, and still to this day, that's the main airport in Dallas. All right, Love Field.
What time did it arrive again, you said?
Body is, it doesn't say precisely when the body arrives, but the body is being loaded at 2:38. So this is happening quick.
31 minutes between leaving and loading.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, this would give you the impression that you have somebody that is making very specific decisions at this moment in time, that everything is being coordinated along the way. They want to get his body loaded up and get out of there immediately. Oh, and by the way, you got to get President Johnson, his entourage on there, and you also have to find this judge that's going to swear him in on the plane. And let's don't forget the First Lady. She's got to be on there with her staff. So everybody's being quickly kind of corralled and placed onto the airplane at this point in time. And they're going wheels up as soon as they can. And while they're in the air, Lee Harvey Oswald is actually going through his first interrogation. That's at 3. So he's
3 on the dot.
3 on the dot, yeah. And he has been found at 1:40. So they've hooked him up already. They drug him out of the theater, and there's a couple of famous images that they captured of him being brought out of the theater. He's drug along. He's placed into a squad, and they escort him down to the jail at this point in time. And when 3 o'clock rolls around, they're interrogating him at that point in time. And it's also at this point in time where they do the first paraffin test on Lee Harvey Oswald. Where
The first what?
Paraffin test. This is a test that used to be administered using warm wax on the hands to try to lift for gunshot residue. And they actually did paraffin test on his face as well. So it's an application of warm wax. It's taken and placed on there, and any kind of particulate matter that is associated with any of the products of gunshot residue. We've got barium, antimony, and lead. That's what you're looking for. It's going to be taken, and that's going to be tested. They're going to take it off of his face. Well, why? Well, do they already know, or do they suspect, and I think that they did, that he was the shooter? Not of the officer, but he's the shooter up in the school book depository. Well, why would you do his face? Well, because he's leaning into the rifle like this.
Right.
And as he engages, you're going to have particulate gunshot residue that's going to place itself on his face at that moment in time. So that's when that first occurs. And it is claimed that test came back positive. Okay.
Claimed.
Yeah. That's what they've said.
We'll come back to that.
At 4:30 p.m., there's this infamous presser that's given with this Dr. McClelland, who states the cause of death was due to a massive head and brain injury from a gunshot wound to the left temple. Now, let's just think about that just for a second. When we began to think about what exactly a gunshot wound to the left temple means, he's identifying this as a point of injury or insult at that point in time to the left temple. Why does he make that statement at that moment in time? I don't know. But that's what he is putting forth to everybody. And that's the first news that anybody really hears about specific anatomical location. I guess it's Eastern time now. We're going to 6 p.m. Air Force One arrives in Maryland. So they've touched down at Andrews at this point in time. And they're going to head to the hospital with the casket.
Where was the casket during the flight?
It was in the hold down below.
It was down below.
Yeah. And
So
there
no
was
one
Secret
can be
Service
down there.
agent with the body, from what I understand. It's a pressurized area. There was somebody down there with the body.
Do we know who that was?
It was one of the Secret Service agents. I don't know this person's name off the top of my head.
Interesting. Okay.
So this is also critical and something that I think that people need to be made aware of, and it's a critical factor that plays into this that we're going to have to come back to. When they go to Bethesda is a naval hospital. It is claimed that the president's wife wanted to go to Bethesda, a naval hospital, because he was a Navy man. You know, he was PT boat captain. He had been in the Navy. Navy had claimed him as their own. He had a lot of pride in that, so that's where she wanted to go. The problem arises here with the fact of who is on staff at Bethesda. And you're looking at two you're looking at two hospital pathologists that are at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and they come into play big time in this particular case because they have no experience with forensic autopsies, period. They've never done a single one in their entire existence. They're hospital pathologists. And hospital pathologists are great. If you need to get a gangrenous leg examined that's been amputated, take a look at a placenta after birth, a tumor that needs to be examined, or if you need your labs checked out, because they manage the laboratory as well. But they're not forensic scientists. They have not been trained in this area. But that's where the president's remains go. And it was her choice to do this, where, again, an opportunity has been missed. Because remember, back in Dallas, who do we have there that was in the trauma center, that was office there? Well, that's Dr. Rose. He was there, forensic pathologist. That's the first one that they bypassed. So here they go. They're going to Bethesda Naval Medical Center, and the president's body is going to be taken there. It's offloaded, kept there, and it's going to fall to these two pathologists to do the autopsy. And it's essential to understand this. These two individuals are active duty members of the U.S. military. And they fall under the direct chain of command of those that are in authority relative to particularly those that are associated with the president's personal physician, who is also a naval doctor. And he's going to be at the autopsy as well. He is the only person that was in the trauma room with the president, and the only person that was in the autopsy room with the president, which is an interesting little fact along the road here. Mm-hmm. So back to 4:30 p.m., we've got McClelland making this comment about the left temple. Mm-hmm. Air Force One has arrived in Maryland. They go to the hospital.
At 6.
At 6. Then at 7, Jackie and RFK enter Bethesda Naval Hospital. RFK signs an order for the president's autopsy, and the autopsy is performed. Now, let me be very specific. The autopsy starts at about 7:30 or 7:35, okay, that evening. So first shots were fired at 12:29. You've already got him rolling into the autopsy suite at 7 p.m. Eastern, where the autopsy is going to be performed. And that's a pretty quick turnaround.
What's the disadvantage there?
What's the disadvantage is that with moving at such a quick rate, you are not, or maybe there was not an interest, I don't know, in bringing all of available resources at your disposal to bear and to wait, to have every person that you could there in that location to assist with the assessment. And I'm not talking about military types. They're a dime a dozen, particularly around D.C. They're everywhere, and everybody wants to be in charge. What I'm talking about are board-certified forensic pathologists. You had Dr. Russell Fisher that was down the road in Baltimore, highly respected, renowned forensic pathologist right down the road. You had Dr. Werner Spitz that was in Detroit, hour away by plane. He could have been there. You had Dr. Milton Helper from Chief Medical Examiner's Office of the City of New York that was roughly an hour away, if that, from Bethesda, that could have been brought in just, at a snap of a finger. These were some of the most eminent forensic pathology scholars in the world. These practitioners had no peer, okay? But yet it's at that moment in time that they decided to trust these two hospital pathologists with arguably the biggest crime that has ever been committed in U.S. history, to do the examination of the central piece of evidence, the body of the President of the United States. They were going to be tasked with this.
Was RFK aware of the fact that it was them doing this and their lack of qualifications?
I don't know what level of awareness he would have had of, okay, I'll put it to you this way. I don't know what level of awareness that Robert F. Kennedy would have had of board certifications and all that sort of thing as it applies to forensic pathology. Forensic pathology as a practice, where it was recognized board-certified practice, the first one, I think, and I'm probably going to misspeak this, had occurred. The first person was certified like in the late 50s or maybe 1960. So it was in its infancy. But you had people like Werner Spitz, you had people like Milton Helpern, and he's considered to be, if we had, okay, in forensic pathology, if we had a Mount Rushmore, his face would be on it. And he's right up the road. And Russell Fisher, too, who actually, along with Werner Spitz, wrote the definitive text in forensic pathology. Spitz and Fisher. I've referenced it my last time I was here. They were within reach. They could have been there because these guys. Imagine how many homicides come through.
Oh, sure.
NYC. Imagine how many homicides come through Baltimore. How many come through Detroit, Chicago, all of these other places where it is daily, every single day, where these people are doing assessments on gunshot wounds.
I understand that it's chaotic. Obviously, everyone's in shock. The fucking president just got murked on TV. But like, where's the chief of staff? Where's the secretary in the office? Where's like there are so many people, even back then, obviously, around the United States president every day who are, they're all devastated. We're all devastated when this is happening. But there's not someone who can be like, all right, asking the question, who's performing this? What are their qualifications? Is that what it's supposed to be? Like, that's what I don't. There is some clear, on top of whatever sinister things you want to point to, there's also some insane incompetence that obviously sinister people didn't fully account for and they got lucky with. And this seems to be one of them, one of the many.
Well, if you like that one, let me give you another one.
All right. Go ahead.
If I could make you any more glum over this whole thing.
Yeah.
Right down the road at Walter Reed Hospital, it's Army Hospital, okay, indwells what's referred to as the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Okay. Says it all in the name, doesn't it? And it is the place from which trauma, as a matter of fact, wound ballistics have been studied there for years and years. And there's a character that plays into all of this that is essential in understanding this narrative. Because by virtue of the fact that they allowed the Kennedy family in this traumatized state to make the decision that they were going to go to Bethesda, they bypassed Walter Reed. If they'd gone to Walter Reed, they would have had not only the full depth and breadth of forensic knowledge there as it applies just simply to the examination of firearms trauma, they would have had a board-certified forensic pathologist right there as well, with all of the assets of the federal government at their disposal. And for whatever reason, they decided not to do this. But for they had some awareness that they were in over their heads.
What makes you say that?
Well, after they had started the autopsy, let me back up. The two doctors at Bethesda, whose names were Humes and Boswell, they were U.S. Navy folks, okay? Humes is the ranking officer. He's in charge of the autopsy. Again, these are hospital pathologists. You need to get a tumor examined, he's your man. There's another gentleman who is actually located at AFIP. His last name is Fink, all right? He's a physician. He is an eminent forensic pathologist. Now, granted, he has not practiced forensic pathology in 2 years, but he is a forensic pathologist. He's at AFIP, all right? They call him prior to starting the autopsy, and they say, we need you to get down here to assist us with, I'm sure he's already heard about it. You know, it's on the news. It's in all the papers.
Yeah, we got a random murder today.
Yeah. We need you to get over here. So he's got to come up from Walter Reed and get to Bethesda. He's aware. He transports up there. But before he gets there, they've already started the autopsy. And as a matter of fact, not only have they already started the autopsy, they've removed the president's brain at this point in time before Fink ever walks through the door. And I can imagine, you know, this is just me. If it was, you know, it's like, well, the hell did you call me for? You know, you realize this is my area of expertise. Well, his true area of expertise is the study of wound ballistics. You know, all of these studies that were done where they were firing weapons into animals that the Army did, you know, because they're trying to judge the effectiveness of certain small arms that they might be using. Also trying to understand injuries that are occurring on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And the Army has a long history of studying their weapons to try to understand their effective nature. And there has to be somebody that does this, okay? And he's in that sphere, okay? But he's better than the tumor guy, okay? Or the tumor guys. He understands something about forensic pathology. He's board certified, and he sure as hell understands gunshot pathology. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that the critical injury that the president has sustained is to his head. But yet you can't hold off long enough to wait until the guy that knows what's going on shows up in order to assist, and not just assist, but just to examine, to put in their 2 cents.
The room they were in, though, there's a ton of people in that room. No?
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard estimates. I heard one estimate when I don't know that this is valid. I've heard one estimate up to 38, then I've heard 33, then I've heard 28, and the number, you know, varies depending upon, you know, but there were a copious number of people that were in this place. And that tells me, having worked with forensic pathologists for a goodly portion of my adult life, the one thing that I know, and you will never convince me otherwise, is that the forensic pathologist, if you are in the autopsy suite, it is their world. Mm-hmm. It is nobody else's. I've actually worked with a forensic pathologist that was covered in blood, took his surgical gloves off, and was about to beat a police officer's ass in the autopsy suite. Because,
love that. Good guy.
Well, because he was being disrespected by the police officer that was there, and the cop threatened this physician. Well, it's his environment. He's making the decisions here, and that's generally how they're viewed. And but not in this case. You had all manner of military officials that were there. Lord only knows who else may have been occupying that space. You had Secret Service, 2 FBI agents who became critical later because of what they witnessed and what they saw were there. They were representatives. So you have all of these individuals, and it's kind of in this kind of classic configuration where I think that all of us have seen a surgical, what they refer to as a surgical theater, where you've got people that are sitting like in a balcony and they're looking down.
Remember the show The Nick?
Yeah.
Clive, is it Clive Owen? Is that his name?
Yeah, it was. I think it was Clive Owen. Actually, I was thinking about the episode of Seinfeld where the junior mint goes into the body. So that's a surgical theater. Yeah. So anyway, you have this environment, and these are they're set up more like grandstands, and you've got three rows of these things that are there, so that people can watch, and it's meant as a location for students to come in and observe an anatomical dissection, so that they can glean, because at Bethesda they've got medical students that are running through various training that are there, and you might have a group. If they have an interesting case, the pathologist will do the autopsy, and they can see what the pathologist is doing, and he might bring over a bit of tissue for them to say, to talk about the anatomical description. These are my findings, this sort of thing, and go back to doing the autopsy. Not in this case. This is a floor show. You've got. I was wondering if they were serving drinks or something. Cigarette gals walking around.
Oh my God, are they all in there ripping bogues like it's Mad Men?
Yeah, absolutely.
Come on.
During this time.
Come on.
Yeah, one guy claims
like ash butts on the fucking president's open one. Come on.
Yeah, there's one story, I think, that in Stone's documentary where he talks about Curtis LeMay was physically there and smoking a cigar, and the autopsy assistant Humes tells the autopsy assistant, "What the hell is that smell? Go, tell them to put that damn thing out." He walks over to Curtis LeMay.
It's a victory cigar.
And LeMay blows the smoke in his face.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would have been going on, and but it's the pathologist world, and what that tells me is this: is that if this kind of behavior is allowed, then that means the pathologists are not in charge. And I think that that's the bottom line, that they're not dictating what should take place in this environment. And that's scary because it's not simply an autopsy. It is probably one of the most complicated physical examinations from a forensic standpoint that could take place. Because first off, you're talking about gunfire that has taken place at a distance. So ranges are going to be indeterminate, which means you're not going to have like a deposition of gunpowder and all those sorts of things where we try to determine, from the muzzle distance from the end of the muzzle to whatever's deposited on clothing or injuries and all that sort of thing. You're not going to have any of that that's present. So you're really going to have to put your thinking cap on when you're assessing even the slightest injury that may be presenting before you on the president's remains. And to have this kind of distraction at this moment in time, because you can just imagine, just think about the scene at this moment in time, because you've got people talking to one another. Mm-hmm. You've got people getting up and moving around. There might be people that get up out of the stands, walk over there to look to see what's happening. You've got, and not to mention the technicians that are there. You've got photographers that are walking around. You've got a diener that's there, the autopsy assistant. You've got these two physicians. Then Fink shows up. He's there. So you've got all of these players that are entering onto the stage in this environment.
And there's no closed circuit TV?
No, none whatsoever. And they want to see, because they're there for that reason.
Yes.
They want to see. They want to bear witness to it. Now, what their motivations are individually, I have no idea. I mean, why would a 4-star general need to be present at the president's autopsy? What would be the purpose of that?
Curtis LeMay is at the middle. We've talked about this in other podcasts. I had Stuart Wexler in here recently.
I have like 4 theories that I bat around.
Just to reiterate, what are those for?
Okay. Pentagon, broadly speaking, anti-Castro, much more localized organized crime that could go to some of the people surrounding an organized crime like Bonanno, and the coup in Dallas, Skorzeny-Lafitte plot.
What if it's a mix?
That's why this case is so crazy, because it can be. Because the Pentagon had a close relationship with Otto Skorzeny, according to Ganis. Specifically, Lemnitzer, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
And he came up again, because obviously, he was heavily involved in the Defense Department, was a high-up military guy, and you look at what his history is with some other things. This is a guy at the middle of some of the UFO stuff. He's in the middle of this Kennedy shit, and the historians around the case who look at this and look at it more like Danny Jones had on John Newman, who's probably the most renowned historian at this point on the case in existence. And he said, quite simply, it's a coup d'etat. And LeMay is a guy they look at with this, and the irony of him being in that actual fucking room, blowing smoke into people's face with a cigar. I mean, you heard me say, it's a victory cigar, potentially.
Yeah, I think a question I would pose to anybody that was there, let me give you some context here. First off, let me ask you this, Julian. Have you ever been to an autopsy?
No.
Okay. All right.
Wasn't planning on it.
Well, I've taken several friends to autopsies over the years. As a matter of fact, here's a little aside. One of the first dates I had with my wife, I took her to an autopsy.
You told me that on the last podcast. That was. No, you didn't. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
you did not tell me that. You told me that it was one of the first dates you told her what you did.
Yeah,
you took her to an autopsy?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I sure did. Took her physically, and she's a science person, so she was fascinated by this. She wanted to, and I was assisting in private autopsies at the time, and she wanted to be there, and she found it intriguing. Got her all gowned out and everything, and it was
stick a finger in there.
No. I think I did allow her to hold a brain and a heart though after it had been removed, and she was fascinated by it. Truly, okay. However, I took my little brother. I think when he was 18 years old, he was dying to go to an autopsy, and got him all gowned out. Took him to the autopsy, and as soon as I'd opened the head and got the striker saw out, which is that high-pitched sounding saw, and I placed it to the skull, and it makes that high-pitched sound that ee, and bone dust is flying everywhere. I was working with the forensic pathologist there, and she was from Great Britain. I'll never forget it. And she points with, she's got this long sectioning knife that looks like a big butcher knife in her hand, and she says, "Oh dear, your brother,"
he's down.
and he's laying on the floor. I've had cops pass out at autopsies, all of these sorts of things. And as hilarious as that is, as funny as it is, I have to ask myself this question. How many other autopsies had any of these people ever been to? And why do you select this particular autopsy to attend? Also, this is a homicide case. Again, I bring us back to that. We have to keep that in focus. This is a homicide. How do you rationalize, if you're in control of this environment, allowing anyone that is not directly involved in this case to be there? Because if you're looking to prosecute somebody, this is an investigation. Would you allow this individual to step inside the tape? Would you allow them to go to the crime lab and watch while you're processing evidence there? Would you be there? Would you allow them to watch you lift fiber evidence?
But it's also not just that, too. If that person, in this case, they're thinking it's Lee Harvey Oswald, if he's going to have a defense attorney who can point to mistakes that were made in the handling of evidence after the case, they can, I'm not a lawyer, but from other cases I've heard about.
Go ahead with your train of thought. I'm going to validate you here.
They can pick apart things as tampering with evidence, and
the evidence that you would glean in a case like this is not worth the gunpowder to blow it to hell. You would be laughed out of a court if any defense attorney worth their salt would be aware of the presence of anybody in this environment other than those that are directly involved in the investigation. And keep in mind here, and this is a very sinister thing as well, Lee Harvey Oswald was still alive at this point in time.
Yes.
You had 2 FBI agents that were there. Trust me, they know what the score is. They know that this is a criminal investigation. They're there taking notes. You've also got Dr. Fink that's there, okay? Well, Dr. Fink is a forensic pathologist. He's got experience with criminal cases. And so he certainly knows. Now, I don't give much credence, particularly in this. I don't view. I got to be really careful what I say here. I have a lot of respect for people that are in the Secret Service, but they are not forensics people in the sense that they're going to be processing a crime scene like this that's involving physical evidence regarding a homicide. Now, they're fine investigators, particularly when it comes to currency and those sorts of issues, and they understand basic issues when it comes to chain of custody, preservation of evidence, all those sorts of things. But for me, just the fact that you have all of these people in this autopsy suite while the President of the United States is being prosected might approach, I can't say that it's sacrilegious, all right, because this is not a religious matter, but it is arguably one of the most disrespectful things that happened all along the way, not to mention you're running foul of the law. If you have an understanding of the law, you have an understanding of presentation of evidence in court, why would you run the risk of contaminating everything that you're trying to glean at this autopsy that is going to be presented in court? Unless
you're in on it.
I don't know. It baffles the mind as far as I'm concerned. You've got a bunch of cigar chompers that are sitting there and doing whatever it is that they do. I don't understand what their purpose is. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to go out and have a cup of coffee and talk about what the president's heart looked like? Is that what you're going to do? Precious memories here, or is that the purpose of this? And it only takes a few people that are sophisticated enough to validate that something happened. Okay.
I don't disagree with you. I'm looking at it in the chaos of the moment, and I think it's totally insane how this was handled by the people who are in charge, who are supposed to know this. But it's probably some combination of the historical part of the moment, the shock of the moment, and I mean, there's the sinister nature as well. But for some of the other people in there, the tragedy porn that comes with that you see in your business all the time when you're breaking this stuff down. You and I have talked about on the last podcast. We've talked about it off podcast. You have such a respect and reverence for the fact that when you're talking about these cases, you are talking about lives lost and families and people in the middle. And that's because you're a good guy and this was your life, and like you have an understanding of that. And yet, unfortunately, sometimes when people get really into this true crime stuff these days, it's because they're like fans of the whole thing and they can't fucking help themselves. And so in this situation, some of those same human elements of like, oh my God, the president's having an autopsy happening and I can go in, they're not necessarily thinking about the trauma of what they're going to see, I would imagine, in that moment. They're the people who have a chance at a front row seat at something that, their great grandkids are going to talk about. Right. And I think they just walk the fuck in if they're allowed to. I'm just guessing. Don't know.
You're talking about a military facility.
Yes.
And these people have stars on their shoulders. And here's one more thing that's kind of very sad about this. The ink wasn't even dry on the piece of paper that Robert Kennedy signed while his brother's widow stood at his side. They are probably still in the building as they put the cold steel to President Kennedy's body at that point in time. And here you have this gallery of people that have shown up. And, I know that out of respect, his remains were met upon landing at Andrews. That's what you do, So what are we going to do now? Are we all going to convoy over to Bethesda? We're going to pile in and go into the autopsy suite. And we're going to sit here with the same expectancy as if you're a father waiting for a child to be born. No, that's an insult to that. No, you're there for either to gloat or because it's a gore show. Maybe the people that are there, like the FBI agents, they have to be there,
sure,
because they're documenting. They're literally documenting
it's an investigation.
An investigation.
Yeah.
They're there documenting history. You've got the photographers that are there, snapping images and this sort of thing at the direction of the doctors who don't know what they're doing. It's such an imperfect storm. I mean, it truly is. Yeah, it really is.
Imperfect storm's a generous way of putting that, I'll say for sure. But I think we're almost like at the end of that timeline with this, right? Like, so they do like, how long did that take, that autopsy?
Till about midnight, 11, midnight.
So they're working on him for, is that a normal length, or would you expect longer?
If you're dealing with competent people, it all depends on, it's like anything else in life. How do you utilize your time? Because that amount of time can be spent painstakingly, being painstakingly thorough. These guys didn't even examine the clothing, which is a real problem for me, because with any kind of forensic autopsy, you have to take the totality of the circumstances and the totality of the evidence that you have. And let's face it, clothing is a big thing here, because that comes into play relative to some of the comments that have been made relative to this defect that's in the president's neck. How does that play in to the tracheostomy site? Also, how does it play in as far as wound ballistics? There have been some people that have stated that the injury that is on the neck, which, again, let me back up, because I'm just assuming everybody has all of this stuff contained in their brain like I do. I'll bear that burden for everybody. But you have something that's called shoring, S-H-O-R-E, I-N-G, S-H-O-R-I-N-G, shoring, which is where you have a gunshot wound where something is an element, like, for instance, if you're against a wall and you're shot and the bullet passes through your body and attempts to exit rearward, your back is shored against the wall. So it's going to dictate the nature of how that injury is going to appear at autopsy. And one of the things that kind of came out relative to President Kennedy's injury, this tracheostomy site, is that the collar, as you can see in all the images, where he's arriving in Dallas and that sort of thing, his collar is tightly buttoned. He's wearing a tie. Mm-hmm. And so it would approximate this area where the projectile may have passed through, if this is an exit right here. And it's going to change the appearance of the defect in the neck, the anterior neck. So with that said, because they utilize this site in the trachea, which is our windpipe, everybody will just kind of go south of your Adam's apple, right in this mm-hmm. area, cartilaginous body. They use that as a spot. It was fortuitous for them, for the ER staff. They used that as a spot to initiate the tracheostomy, where they could put a breathing tube into the president's neck. So, folks might say, wow, that's really horrible that they would do that. No, it's not. If you're in life-saving mode, you're not thinking about forensic science at that point in time. Sure. If it was me, I hope that they wouldn't be thinking about forensic science. But I've seen this done in any number of steps as well, in any number, of other cases. For instance, if you have a gunshot wound in the chest, and an individual is shot, let's say, for instance, the round passes through their intercostal space, which is kind of, anybody who's ever worked out and you've pulled an intercostal muscle in your ribs, it's one of the most painful things in the world.
Oh,
it's the rib meat, if you will. Yeah. Well, I've seen projectile defects that pass through this intercostal space, and they're used for chest tubes. They just go into the defect created by the projectile, they cut open, and then they stick a tube into the chest. Well, what does this do? Well, the chest is filling up with blood, so they've got to empty that pleural space out of blood, because if not, the lungs can't. I'm sorry, guys. Give me a second. I'm really tired.
You need some more coffee?
Yeah, I probably do, but let me finish this thought. I'm sorry. The lungs can't inflate properly, so you have to release that pressure. They saw this location in the neck in that way. They already had a defect. There's no reason to take a scalpel and open up another location. You have to establish an airway to get oxygen into the lungs so that the president at least has some kind of remote chance of surviving. And so this wound was compromised. Now, I've kind of gone a long way around the barn there to make this simple point. It's that kind of analysis, that kind of, when you get into that kind of granular area from a forensic science standpoint, where you want to take your time and you want to have as many eyes on these insults to the body that are trained to really assess what's going on, as opposed to the other side, where are you taking so much time because you don't know what you're doing and you're trying to figure things out. And this is kind of evidenced where, you know, we're thinking about injuries to the skull and all these sorts of things where you're looking for internal versus external beveling, which is where if folks that are watching and listening will think about this. If you've ever seen a BB or a rock that passes through a piece of glass, okay? As, let's say we take a rock, or let's make it a bit more efficient here. Let's say we fire a BB gun through a window pane, okay? The exterior of the window where the projectile passes through the pane is going to be very smooth and will only have that hole that passes through the glass. However, on the inside of the glass, you're going to have what's called beveling. So that portion, those bits of glass that that populate that area on the other side of the entrance defect, it's going to blow out. And it almost looks like a divot, like in golf or something, where it's kind of concave. Well, that's one of the ways, particularly with bony structures in forensic pathology, we try to determine directionality of bullets. So let's just say, for instance, an individual is shot in the back of the head. Well, the round passing, and we're not talking about, let's keep it very simple, we're not talking about where heads actually come apart. It's a close range thing where you got gas injuries. We're just talking about at a distance. You have a round that passes through the back of a skull. Well, the exterior defect, okay, it'll have a circular defect, perhaps maybe slightly irregular, and then that's the external table of the skull, but the interior table of the skull will be blown out. You'll have this little divoted kind of area that they refer to as beveling. That's internal beveling. Now, let's say that this is a through and through gunshot wound. It enters in the back, so smooth on the outside here, right? Passes through the internal table of the skull, bevels internally, and then it passes through the front of the skull. So on the interior surface of the skull, on the anterior aspect, the front, let's say the forehead, going to be smooth. Externally, it'll bevel.
Yeah.
And so that requires, on the part of the technician, the forensic pathologist, a certain amount of scientific sophistication to figure that out. Sounds rather simple, but when you're trying to determine the angle at which this came in, you can have all kinds of little unanticipated things that might happen relative to directionality. You have to determine, say, for instance, if in many cases, if a round passed through, say, an intermediate target like a pane of glass or another person, it's going to change the configuration of the round itself. The bullet might become deformed. Matter of fact, it might deform upon making initial contact here, and the dynamics of the exterior injury or the exiting injury might look very atypical because the bullet has already passed through one bony surface. Bullet becomes fragmented or compromised in some way structurally. Well, the bullet's deformed. It's going to have kind of a deformed defect on the outside. So there's all of these factors that you have to incorporate into your thinking as a forensic scientist in this very high-pressure environment, particularly when you're talking about the examination of a sitting president of the United States. And now you're doing it in front of an audience.
A lot you can miss.
A lot, yeah. It's the devil I know it's rote. Devil's in the details. Pardon me. When you see the monumental task that these men were put in the position to undertake, it's part of you really feels sorry for them because, let's understand. Yeah, these guys are officers in the United States Navy, but they are troops. Okay, they have people they answer to. And yeah, captain is certainly a high rank in the Navy, somebody to be respected, but you ain't no admiral. You're not a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You're colonel. I mean, rephrasing, you're a captain in the Navy, colonel in the Army, same rank. And by God, you will do what you're being told to do. And so, you look at them and they become these kind of sympathetic characters in this whole thing.
Depending on who it is, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine, both Humes and Boswell, they get up, I don't know, that morning, that
Can
Friday
you remind
morning.
people who they are?
Yeah. So Humes is actually the ranking officer, and he's the hospital pathologist. Boswell is also his colleague and a serving naval officer. He's a pathologist as well. And the point I was going to make, you get up that morning and, you've read your paper, you've had your coffee, you hop in your car, you drive over to Bethesda, you walk in the room. Maybe in the paper you saw that the president was going to be in Dallas that day. Okay, well, he's everywhere all the time. You don't give it a second thought. What you are thinking about are the surgical samples you're going to have to examine that day. You're sitting at a microscope, you're dissecting a tumor, you're making adjustments in the laboratory, all these sorts of things that happen in the course of your daily daily work. Did you wake up that morning thinking that you were going to be doing an autopsy on the president of the United States that night?
Probably not.
Just imagine.
Yeah.
So there's no way that anyone could ever convince me, if you were gaming this in any way, if you were gaming this out in any way, that we've identified these two guys to be the fall guys in this case. We'll say that they were, just doing what they were told, or we'll say that they were inept. And, let's face it, they were not sufficient to the task that was put in front of them. But I don't know too many people that would have been, other than a board-certified forensic pathologist that had a lot of experience in this world. And another character kind of enters into the stage here. You remember how I talked about at Walter Reed Army Hospital, where the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology was housed. Well, remember how I said that Dr. Fink had been contacted. He's in charge of wound ballistics for AFIP. Dr. Fink has a boss too, and this guy is the head of AFIP, and he is also a forensic pathologist. Well, he was there. He's the first director of this thing, all right? He's there. Now, you talk about chain of command. You talk about all of these little things you have to think about in the military. This guy is Colonel Ed Johnson. He's a physician, forensic pathologist. Where in the hell was he in all of this? Because he's at Walter Reed. He's the one that makes the calls relative to forensic pathology in the military. AFIP actually stands for Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. So at this organization, you've got representatives from the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army that are there. They're all physicians, and they handle everything pathology-wise worldwide for the U.S. services, and that includes forensic pathology. Now, nowadays, they have what's referred to as I'm going to get this wrong, but it's the Armed Forces Medical Examiner Service, or Medical Examiner's Office. It didn't exist then. So the AFIP occupied that space with a section that was called forensic pathology. And they were kind of the de facto medical examiner for the military. And we can't forget our history here either. And this is, I don't know if anybody knows this, but every president that was assassinated, let's think about them. It's Lincoln, okay, Garfield,
Yeah.
McKinley,
Yep.
and
Kennedy.
Well, Lincoln, when his autopsy was performed, the individuals that were involved in that examination did a limited dissection on President Lincoln. It was head only. They didn't open him up completely. This is in 1865. Okay. By the way, if anyone's ever been or has never been to the Ford Theater, I recommend you go. That museum.
Were you there that night?
No, I might look like it, but I wasn't. Selling peanuts. Fascinating to see Booth's boot, see the weapon, all of that sort of thing. Great trip. So he was autopsied by military physicians. His examination was conducted by them. Garfield, famously, who lingered.
Was that 84?
Yeah.
94?
Yes. And as a matter of fact, it was at a time where Alexander Graham Bell got involved in it and actually used the first rudimentary form of X-ray in order to try to locate the ball. He was shot at a train station, I think actually in Jersey.
In Jersey, not Long Branch, 1881, September 19th. Long Branch is probably about it's 35 if I'm driving from here.
No kidding.
Yeah. Chris Olave's driving. It's probably a half hour.
Oh, Lord. Yeah. Let's don't go there.
Sorry.
Broken-hearted Saints fan here.
Anyway.
With Garfield, he lingered in tremendous pain. But guess what? They did his autopsy. It was a complete autopsy. As a matter of fact, I think it's being held by AFIP. I'm not sure. They took out a goodly portion of his spine. They still have it.
No shit.
Yeah. Isn't that
you
cool?
Got buried like all wrinkled and.
Well, you got to remember General Sickles, Dan Sickles. He would famously, he lost his leg in one engagement, and it was amputated, and he kept his leg and donated it to the Smithsonian, I think, or maybe it was the Armed Forces Museum. I'm not sure. And he used to go visit his leg, so that was kind of an interesting little aside. But then we go to McKinley, and McKinley again. Garfield his autopsy was performed by military physicians, Army physicians. McKinley, when he was shot in Buffalo, he suffered greatly as well, but he was also thoroughly autopsied. Now, you're talking about these two presidents, one in the 1880s. McKinley was in 1901, I think.
I think that's right.
Some 62 years after McKinley, President Kennedy is assassinated. In the world, mind you, that we're entering into, space age. Just let this sink in for a second. You've got this homicide case, and according to what I understand, the widow is dictating what kind of autopsy is going to be performed.
Yeah, I'd heard, yeah.
And there's something in the morgue that we refer to, and not many people have heard this term. It's called tongue to testicles. And what that means is that when we're going to do an autopsy, obviously we're going to remove the brain. This is for a full autopsy, and we do full autopsies in almost every homicide that occurs. I can't think of any case that I've been involved in on a homicide where we didn't do a full autopsy. That means that everything comes out. And literally, with a male, you go from the tongue to the testicles. It all comes out.
One at a time?
It all depends. There's two different methodologies. You have what's referred to as en bloc, which means that you go when you've seen the classic Y incision that's made into a body that's being autopsied. It starts at the apex of both shoulders, goes down, meets in the middle, goes all the way down to the groin. We open the body up, take out the chest plate, and then you reflect the chest up so that it's literally over the face. Go up along the trachea and you remove what are referred to as the organs of the neck. We've got the trachea, we've got a lot of vasculature that's running through here, all the way up to the tongue, through the floor of the mouth. We take it out. And when you do en bloc, which means in one big section, you trim out, following down the spine, pulling on the tongue as you go down, and you remove all the way down to the sigmoid colon, actually to the rectum, and then press the testicles up, remove them out, and everything is laid out. That's en bloc.
What does that look like if it's all? Because you know what I picture? I picture like a sack of skin sitting there, nothing else.
No,
I know it's not like that, but
you're talking about the remains of the
yeah,
and coarsely. This is very coarse. I actually had a forensic pathologist that used to say this. That really made my skin crawl, and it takes a lot to make my skin crawl. But he would say, as he's walking out the door to go do autopsies, he'd say, "Let's go make human canoes."
What?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, no. But no, the body isn't just a sack; it's a shell, and because you have the framework of the ribs that are there, and it's there, but it's just an open, gaping space at this point. Now that's en bloc. Many times, pathologists will do this so that they can really look at all of the organ systems in their totality. They can kind of flip it over and get a posterior view, see everything, because you've gone right down the spinal column, where you can examine, the backside of the aorta and all of these other landmarks along the way. Then you have organ by organ examinations, and in a complex gunshot wound case like this, you would do organ by organ. But remember what I said about the widow dictating only a partial autopsy be done. Julian, this is where we really come to a point where it's very troubling because though an examination of the neck was performed, the organs of the neck in JFK's case were not removed. So the trachea remained in place. Now, what do we know about the trachea? Well, the trachea is the place where the round allegedly exited, or depending on how you look at it, entered.
And that was at the beginning of the film when he goes like this
Yeah.
with his neck. First shot.
It's like this. It's a neuroreflex where you do like this. I've seen people that have actually hung themselves where they're, remember how I was saying that they videotape themselves sometimes? You'll see hanging victims that will do this, like this. Their thumbs will extend. You see that there's a lot of people that videotape themselves doing autoerotic stuff and all that. But anyway, it's a neuromuscular response. This is critical. We're trying to track the wound.
Yeah.
And then you compare, say, for instance, one of the big bones of contention in the case is placement of this defect that's in the back. The first report came out that, when you first see those images from the morgue, I remember the first time I ever saw the autopsy images, with JFK. And, you're looking, the first time you see this. And I think when I saw them, I can't remember if I was already working in the field or not, but I wanted to be able, just like anybody else, to be able to appreciate, the gunfire related stuff, any kind of insults that were there. And there's this little defect that is right at, and the way they placed it was right at T4. T4 is your fourth thoracic vertebra, is the fourth thoracic vertebra. Now, they had said that it may have clipped the transverse processes, which if you look at vertebral body, it's got these little horns that kind of stick out. So on the right side. And then it passes through the president's body. And of course, you've got this defect in the throat right here where they're saying that it's exiting out of. It's essential that if you're trying to track the wound, one of the ways we track wounds is to follow the path of the projectile and the hemorrhage that's left behind. He was still alive. Okay, so he would have hemorrhaged in this area
when that shot comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and then in the minutes immediately following that, he would have been hemorrhaging through there, or
quick,
seconds rather.
Real quick, just before I forget, because I promised this like 15 minutes ago. Chris, do you mind real fast? Can you run down that same place and just grab him a coffee? Yeah. Because I forgot to ground up those beans. That's my bad. Thanks, bro. Anyway, I'm sorry, Joseph. Continue.
That's all right, bro.
We're going to get you your coffee, keep you awake.
Oh, no. I apologize.
You seem very awake out here. I don't know what you're talking about, but I want to make sure you have it in case you feel like you need it.
Oh. There's never a bad time for coffee.
There's never a bad time for it. A little mud water, too. Mud water's good for you.
Oh, boy.
Good stuff. Anyway, you were talking about the fourth thoracic vertebrae.
Yeah, and so when we're tracking these wounds in the morgue, the forensic pathologists, one of the things they're trying to determine is the angle at which a round comes in. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to kind of follow the path of what we believe is the kind of cavitated area, the space that the projectile has left behind. And we track that with the hemorrhage. Not to mention there's a void there because as the projectile is traveling through the body, it's tearing up tissue along the way. So you can see evidence of that as well. If you have not removed the organs of the neck, okay, there's no way that you can fully appreciate the extent of the trauma, what areas have been impacted. And there's certainly no way that you can, I don't think, accurately understand the trajectory. And trajectory in this case is essential to trying to understand. You know, when you think about this shot that that Oswald had taken from the school book depository.
Do you think he fired that shot? I have to ask that.
I think that there is a high probability that he might have. For me, it wasn't, having been up there, it seemed like it seemed like a shot that you would not think that he would, it was not the most advantageous. And a lot of people have made hay over the fact that there was foliage there,
yes,
obscuring his view, his line of sight. Whereas when they're coming up Elm, I think it's Elm, when they're coming up Elm, open, he's got this view where you've got the static shot for a while, and there's no change in elevation there. They're kind of remaining constant.
Yes.
But when you go to the plaza, by the way, the places, when you're a kid and you hear about it and you see pictures of it, you think it's going to be a lot bigger. It's not big. To me, it wasn't a big space. It just wasn't. But what is significant is that if you, where the president's motorcade made the turn, if you were to take a baseball and place it where they made the turn and just let go of it in that center lane, the ball would just roll. It's got that much of a pitch on the hill. And so the president is not just moving away, but they're moving, they're declining as they're going. So this is going to require a significant adjustment with arguably a very inadequate weapon, I think a very powerful weapon, 6.5 millimeter Carcano round. And it was actually the weapon of choice by the Italian army during World War II. And I think actually going back to, I think Carcano actually was first manufactured, if I'm not mistaken, in the very late 1800s. It's a bolt-action weapon. I think it's got a 6-round internal magazine, which means you have to use a stripper clip to get it down in there. So, it was a cheap weapon. He ordered it, out of the back of a magazine, from this place in Chicago. There's been questions about what he actually ordered and what he actually received. And the reason that's important is the one that he ordered, apparently the barrel is shorter. It's more of a, I'm not going to say it's an assault weapon, like you would think, like an M4 platform or something that our troopers would use. But it's a shorter barreled weapon, the longer barrel, and there was like a 4.5 inch difference, I think, in the length of the barrel when the ballistics expert measured it compared to what he had originally ordered under the name of Heidel. That's going to facilitate more accuracy, the length of the barrel. Maybe, I'm not going to say it would be a sniper weapon, but it might be something that would lend itself to more accuracy. So I think that that's certainly something to be explored. I do know this, is that Carcano round, the 6.5 millimeter round, it stays, and this is kind of interesting, it stays supersonic out to maybe 1,400 yards.
Supersonic?
Yeah, it's going above the speed of sound as it travels out to roughly, I think it's 1,400 yards. 308 that was in use at that particular time, say like a 7.62, it loses supersonic velocity at about 900 yards. So this is a very powerful weapon. I mean, if you were fortunate enough to get rounds on target, it would do a lot of destruction. Yes. So I think that's certainly something to account for. But do I think that shot is possible from the window? Yeah, I think that it's certainly possible.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah, it is. But when you go to the plaza down there and you're taking a look at this whole thing and you're thinking about, I think the Warren report said that there were 3 shots that were fired. You got one that goes wild. It strikes a curb, I think, and it injures a bystander. And then you've got the round in the neck where President, famously raises his arms like this. And then once they emerge from behind that street sign, his head comes apart. And you're thinking about, what that looks like and the nature of the movement of of the impact and that kind of transfer of that inertial energy at that moment of contact. And you can't, I don't care how hard you try, you can't get past that image of the president, as ghastly as it is. You can't get past that image of the president's head coming apart.
Completely.
On the right aspect of his head, and it's easily appreciated in the Zapruder film. But also this transfer of energy where you have his head, famously, as people have said, back and to the left. And he essentially winds up over toward the position of Jackie. Yes. As he is laying like this. Head is kind of opened up. It almost appears to me that based upon that movement, that shot originated from forward and to the right. And, I don't know that I could buy a shot emerging again from that location above him where it generates that kind of movement on his body. Yeah, I don't see that could be possible.
So the theory that we hinted at earlier, I think that they came up with was the magic bullet. And in the movie JFK, where they recount the Garrison trial in New Orleans, which maybe we'll get to some of that in a little bit, but that's probably one of the greatest visuals I've ever seen for explaining the magic bullet. And they reenacted apparently what happened at the trial a few years later when this was the only public trial that ever happened related to anything around JFK. And Jim Garrison, the DA of New Orleans who was running the trial, he had his legal team sit in chairs like they were in the car. And then he pulled out, a replica of the gun or something and traced exactly what the magic bullet that Arlen Specter came up with for the Warren Commission, what it would have had to do. And essentially, if I could give you the cliff notes, if you're watching me on YouTube or on Spotify video right now, the bullet had to go like this. But, but through two different human bodies and end up, like, I think by the time it got to Connally through all the waves of Kennedy, it had to go like in Connally's, I want to say his side or something like that, around out front, into his wrist and down into his hip.
Into his thigh.
I mean, it is the most offensive. Our inspector should have been thrown in jail for the stupidity of that theory.
It's intellectually insulting.
So given the fact that that couldn't have happened, would you agree that it's impossible that all the shots came from behind?
Yes. Yeah. There's no way. This and here's the other thing. We were talking about the energy of this weapon, and energy with every impact. Anytime you pass through any kind of intermediate target, you're not going to have the same. You're not going to have the same amount of energy that bleeds off really quickly. Now you're talking about a round that creates seven bullet holes. That it's really hard to kind of understand that and really make sense of it. And I got to give props real quick here. Relative to this dramatic turn that took place in JFK, and that's to props go to Dr. Cyril Wecht, because he was actually on set.
That's the Pittsburgh guy?
Yeah. Allegheny County. And of course, when it came down to the he was on one of the commissions. He was the only dissenting view among the pathologists, who, interestingly enough, I had mentioned Dr. Russell Fisher, Michael Bodden, were two
Legendary
other.
Bodden, baby.
They concurred that it was Oswald, and Dr. Wecht said that it wasn't. But Dr. Wecht actually gave Stone the idea for this demonstration, this crazy magic bullet. And then, look, Dr. Wecht is not the person that called this the magic bullet. This, as you rightly mentioned, issued forth from the gaping mouth of Arlen Specter. And how this man became a ballistics expert is beyond me. I don't understand that. I don't know. I know that he was a prosecutor. I don't know how much time he ever spent either in a ballistics lab or working in a morgue. I don't know. I'd like to see his CV.
He was young when this happened.
He was very young. Yeah, he was when he when he ascended into this position, and of course his career was made after that. Mm-hmm. But it was something that I think that the American public was willing to buy into, certainly at that time, because this guy had been put forth as, as a shining representative of all things, where he's seeking justice here. He's seeking the ability to, they're looking to him to explain this thing that has done such great harm to the American psyche at this point in time. But, you've got people that are out there in the scientific community, and they're looking at this and they're thinking, this defies all logic. Just from a physical science standpoint, how are you going to make sense of this? How would you go about explaining this to anybody and have them buy into it? And we're just talking about the path of the bullet. You get into things like the ballistics of this weapon. How efficient is this weapon? It doesn't have the smoothest action. You think about cycling 3 rounds through this thing, which is a bolt action weapon. So the reason bolt action weapons are fantastic, particularly if you're going hunting, single shot, you want to take down a deer. All right. But one of the things we came to understand, particularly during World War I, was that when our troops used the 1901 Springfield, as they were actuating the bolt, they had to reacquire the target. That's why in World War II, we went to the Garand, which was a semi-automatic weapon, and you don't have to go through so many machinations in order to reacquire the target through your sight picture. Okay, you essentially can pull the trigger. If you can keep that center post on your target, you got a high likelihood you're going to do a lot of damage. And we come to modern day. We went through the M14, which is kind of a variation of the M1 Garand. Again, semi-automatic, could be fired fully automatic. And then today where we wound up with the M16/M4 platform that we have today. And those are semi-automatic. Some are in full auto mode. But at any rate, I'm chasing rabbits here. The fact that you would be in this environment as they have termed it in the past, a sniper's nest, and you're having to recycle this crappy Italian weapon and then reacquire a moving target through a less than top end scope.
Foliage in the way.
Yeah, with foliage in the way.
It's not happening.
And you know, I don't see. And also, I'm really curious. You know how. You know, as the vehicle is moving away, is moving downrange away from the depository, you really wonder how much speed was it gathering at that point in time as it's going downhill. Remember, I gave you the example of the baseball running down the middle of the lanes, and you think about this vehicle moving away. The limo driver, the Secret Service agent that was operating the vehicle, you know, I guess he's tapping the brake. It didn't look like this was a hand-waving moment for the president. It looks like they were egressing even prior to that. You know, he was acknowledging, but the thing is it's not like he's going through like a crowded area. Have you ever seen that classic image where he's sitting up on the rear of a car and he's like waving at everybody? Yes. It's not that kind of event. They're going from point A to point B.
When they get under that tunnel after he was shot, and they get under the tunnel, they're they're on a highway now.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so this road is turning into a highway.
Yes, it is.
It's very convenient because one of the things I always wondered is I'm like, you got the president in a major United States city, and there's not that many people out there. We've all seen the videos of the 2 days of that trip. I mean, I can roll. I had him in the intro for Stu Wexler's and in some of the mid rolls in Stu Wexler's intro for his episode. You see crowds and like not even standing room only, people on top of each other like sardines. And then you look at the grassy knoll, and there's, you know, a mother and father with a kid right here. You know, there's a few guys over here. Zapruder's got a wide open shot of the image. It's not like there's two people out there. You know, I don't know a number, but there's some people, but there's not hundreds.
No, this is
not.
And
it's because it's, I guess, because it's at the end of the loop, and it's like, okay, he's leaving now.
Right. This is not a parade route. Okay. Right. This is not something, this is facilitating him getting from point A to point B. And people would have been aware of his route. It was well known.
Public.
At that point in time, it was public. And look, everybody wants to have a view of the president. You know, most people do. They want to be able to see him. It's a moment in time that they're going to remember. Kids miss school in order to do this, you know. But yeah, it was coming to a conclusion at this point in time. But then you've got the grassy knoll, which again, I stood there at that fence, which is something that I've always been fascinated by, thinking about what kind of view would I have if I were standing here armed with a weapon. And I'm not, even though I was in the Army National Guard, went through basic training and all that stuff, I barely qualified. I was not a very good shot. I was in intel. And so there's a reason I was not in the infantry.
You seem like a good shot.
I'm not. I'm really not.
I wouldn't cross you at 1 a.m. at night trying to rob you.
I've got bad eyes. So I've always had to rely on what little intellect I have. But at any rate, but with that said, I was thinking, wow, even with a non-scoped weapon, I could, with an iron sight, could make this shot.
Yeah.
If I'm looking down there from that position, because you're able to kind of track all the way along, and you've got any number of points along this way to pull the trigger and initiate that gunfire. And if you're in a resting position on the other side of that fence that's, you know, that has these kind of V cutouts on the top, it's a perfect spot in order to rest a weapon. I think the big question is, you know, would someone have heard the report of that rifle? Because when you see the video many times, you'll see people running toward the grassy knoll. You'll see them running up the hill. I've seen a couple of images of that, and I'm thinking, okay, if somebody was firing from there, would it be your natural inclination to run up the hill toward that sound? but you're in this kind of canyon of buildings. And I'm really curious, when you hear that crack that goes off, if you're in an area that is kind of this man-made canyon, how can you make sense of where the sound is coming from? Is it deceiving in any way? Were they running for their lives, or were they running because they thought that they saw something? Hard to make sense of it. But that seems like it would be a primary location for consideration when you think about the injury that he appears to have sustained at that moment in time when he emerges from behind that sign.
I don't know. Like, I try to put myself in the shoes of being in a traumatic event like that, but it's impossible because your senses, I mean, you dealt with this your whole career with eyewitnesses and stuff. Your senses are so off because not only are you in shock in the moment, like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Not only is it happening so fast, I mean, these shots are getting fired. I forget the exact number of seconds, but it's not long in between all three shots. But you also then afterwards, once all the adrenaline leaves your body an hour later or whatever, you've played this over so many times in your head that it could change. And it does. Data shows that eyewitness testimony changes not because they're lying, but because they start to see things that maybe didn't happen. So especially when you're dealing with not hundreds and hundreds of people standing on this particular spot up there, and they all scatter right away.
Yes.
It gets real hard. If you look at where the grassy knoll is, and I'm sure throughout this episode I will have been putting some images in the corners. When you hear whooshes and stuff, that means an image is there. But if you look at the position of where it is, and that there were people who were sitting, on the grass by where the sidewalk is, and that where that fence is, there were people standing there. I have trouble believing that there wasn't somebody there who saw things and in the chaos was whisked away and said, you didn't see shit.
Yeah, I've thought about that, and particularly what was on the other side of the fence. It was the infamous train yard. We've heard about that, and there were cars that were back there. Here's the thing: if you're utilizing, let's just say that you're a decent marksman, okay, and you were positioned right there, even with an iron sight weapon. That means you don't have a scoped weapon like the one that Oswald had up in the sniper's nest, for lack of a better term. You only have a very few seconds to draw a sight picture where you've got that post on the end of the weapon, and you're drawing a bead on your target. A person really proficient with shoulder-fired arms could make that shot, and then you wouldn't even have to eject the casing. If it's a bolt-action weapon, if you're not using semi-automatic, you're not going to leave spent brass behind. If you're that good, you simply fire the weapon, slowly walk away, get in a vehicle, and you leave, and no one's the wiser. You've taken the weapon away. There's no spent brass to collect. Maybe there's footprints, but there were footprints everywhere. Mm-hmm. There was discarded cigarette butts. Well, hell, everybody in the world smoked back then. My parents smoked. You sit in a cloud of smoke there in the car as you're going down the road. Everybody smoked. So to find any kind of cigarette butts laying around is an indication that people were standing there. It's not a good sign of anything necessarily.
But it would have been a different gun from the side than up in the repository, because the repository was a full load. I forget the full term for it, but you've explained it already. And if the bullets end up in one of two places, they either get lodged in the body somewhere, mm-hmm. or they go through and they're somewhere on the ground.
Yes.
Now there was one, I should mention, there was one that was found beneath Kennedy's body, which I think was the actual quote unquote magic bullet that was found right there, like mm-hmm. on the gurney hours later, like, oh shit, look, we found it. It was definitely placed there. It was in perfect condition. So that's right. A bullshit bullet. But like the very first thing should be you would have different bullets going into him. And I would think that there has to be one at the scene that clearly never got found.
Perhaps there would be. And also, I think another thing to understand here is that any kind of metal fragments that you're locating, and you can see kind of radiographic evidence of this when you're looking at what's called the lateral view of the president's X-rays. You'll see what we refer to as a lead storm, where you've got these components of this lead trail that kind of, appears here as it's passing from front to rear. And some have opined that this is evidence of movement as it begins to kind of spread out in a funnel-like shape as it's losing that inertial energy and the round begins to disintegrate. What happened to the body of the rest of that weapon? Let me restate that. What happened to the rest of that round? I've often wondered if this shot that was facilitated on the president, if it was more of a lateral shot where it may have entered here, okay, and traveled front to rear, slightly from above to below, and you have these accounts of people in the emergency room and even the two FBI agents that were at the autopsy talking about how they could see brain matter extruding from the back of the president's head, because you have, from an anatomical standpoint, you've got the cerebrum, and you've got both a left and right hemisphere, and they're made up of what are referred to as sulci and gyri. So they, when you see these images, at Halloween and whatnot, and people have a brain and it's got those kind of curvy, swiggly lines, like that. Those are sulci and gyri, and you've got two hemispheres. It's very distinctive. But down below the brain, you have what's referred to as a cerebellum. It's a different component, and it has two hemispheres as well. That's distinctly different in appearance. It almost looks like it doesn't have sulci and gyri. It's got these linear components. They're and they run, if you think about it, running east and west. They look like contour lines that you would see on a map. Distinctly different. And to a person, remember how we talked about earlier, I talked about the neurosurgeons.
Yes.
Think they know anything about brains?
Yeah, I think they know a thing or 10.
Wee bit.
Yeah.
They saw cerebellum, extruding from the back of the president's head. And so they're there. This is their business. This is what they do, right? And so one of the amazing things about this, and there's other people, I'm not a Kennedy expert by any means. There have been other people.
I think some people would argue that.
No, I'm really not. But no, I'm just thinking here, other people have commented on this. Julian, when they weighed the president's brain, it weighed 1,500 grams.
And it's supposed to weigh?
About 1,300. You ever seen that image when he emerges from behind the sign? What happens to his head?
Oh, yeah.
It disintegrates. It freaking disintegrates, man.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to sell me, not you, universal you, if you're trying to sell me on the idea that they had a completely intact brain, and he's, if you're saying that it's a 1,500 gram brain for the president, he's the percentile that he's in is it's really up there. Okay. That's I think one of the FBI agents actually said there was a significant amount of his brain missing. So how do we account for this? How do we make sense of this? And of course that, you begin to, people talk about the brain disappearing, and it has. I mean, no one knows what happened to it. But the physicians in the autopsy report allude to the fact that they're going to fix the brain. Not fix it, but they're going to
reconstruct it?
No, they're going to examine it later. And let me kind of tell you how this works, all right? Because a lot of people don't understand what we do.
Keep going.
All right.
I wasn't following.
What we do with brains in the autopsy room. So brains are kind of like, let's see if I was trying to give you, they're a little bit more tense than Jell-O, okay? A little bit more. So just imagine if you've got you make a mold of Jell-O, and you're going to take a butcher knife and you're going to slice it. All right, dependent upon the firmness of it, it's not going to work out real well. The edges are not going to be real neat. It's going to be it'll gum up on your knife and that sort of thing. So what do we need to do in order to get the brain so that it's to a firmness that is sufficient for us to dissect it and examine it? Well, what we do is we take a big bucket. Okay, you fill it up with formalin, which is a type of formaldehyde that we use to preserve tissues with, either in the morgue at the medical examiner's office or at the morgue or the hospital if they're taking tumor sections. You allow it to fix. Now, how do you do that? Well, you take the brain and you flip it over, okay, so that the brain is literally upside down. It's inverted, all right? And there are some little anatomical structures around here, some little vessels, and you've got the optic nerves that are coming off. You take a piece of string, and it's generally the same string that we use to sew the body back up with, and you pull it through these little structures, okay? Mm-hmm. You've got a bucket that's about 2/3 full of formalin. You gently set the brain down into the formalin, and then you take tape, and you tape off the strings on the outside of the bucket, and you shut the lid on the bucket. Set the bucket aside for, I don't know, you can do it for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or whenever you get to it. And by the time you get back to it, the brain has almost achieved, or probably has achieved, the same firmness that a liver has. And it makes it much...
What kind of firm? I mean, I haven't touched a liver recently, so...
Your mom didn't make you eat liver when you were
no.
little?
What kind of firmness are we talking?
It's not as firm as a basketball. But
shit, people eat that?
Yeah, no kidding.
The hell do you guys do down south? You're in Jersey now.
Well, I got to tell you, I didn't do it by my own choice. I was compelled, and a lot of people in my generation were compelled, regardless of geography. Bill's strong muscles, or it's iron rich. They thought it would neutrify the blood. And what we do in the morgue relative to these brains is you do what's referred to as serial sectioning. Now, you do this with every solid organ. So if it's the heart, lungs, the liver, certainly, the kidneys. Imagine you've got a beautiful, fresh-baked loaf of bread, okay? You take your bread knife, right? You start, and how are you going to do it? Well, better than sliced bread, right? Mm-hmm. You slice like this, okay? So that if, let's just say, for instance, you did have that loaf of sliced bread, once you serial section this thing all the way through, this solid piece of bread, you can now take those sections and flip through it almost like a book, okay? And what you're doing, what the pathologist is doing, is they're looking literally for any kind of pathology that occupies those little spaces. All right. So once they find if there's some kind of anomaly there, whether it's a tumor, or maybe they're thinking that the person had a stroke or whatever it is, they can take a section of the brain, okay, and then they'll place it into a cassette. And these little cassettes are these little plastic vented cassettes, and they're dropped into formalin, and they're allowed to fix along with all of the other tissue that we've acquired at autopsy: the heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, spleen, pancreas, sections of the bowel. We'll take sections of the spine, spinal cord, testicles, ovaries, uterus, everything. You get a little section of that. And then what do you do with that? Well, you send them to a histologist, and the histologist fixes them on slides. This is standard. This is standard in any kind of autopsy. And then we can place those on a microscope and look at the anatomy through the scope.
How long has this been the process, approximately?
I don't know. I guess
like, were they doing this shit in the 50s?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so
microscopy has gone on for years.
My math is coming back in from the original opening of this part of the conversation where I asked you 4.5 hours, give or take. Like, how is that for an autopsy? And you're like, it's fast.
No, listen, let me be very specific here. When you ask me about the length of an autopsy, I've been involved in autopsies that took 45 minutes, okay?
To do all this shit?
No, because not everything is done in every one of these autopsies. If you've got, let's just say, for instance, you've got something that is a massive trauma, say it's a single perceived self-inflicted gunshot wound of the head, the pathologist is going to make their way through that pretty quickly. Now, that's just the autopsy itself. We're not talking about the x-rays that happened prior to that, the examination of clothing, all the photography, and there's tons of photography that take place. But when you're talking about an involved homicide with multiple gunshot wounds, where you have to be very exacting, and yes, there would be an awareness of pressure. This is not like being back in the emergency room. Remember when I was talking about, you lose, it's just a patient at that point in time. You're trying to save them. There's an awareness on the part of the pathologist. So you're going to take your time in trying to examine every jot and tittle, as it were, of all of any of the landmarks, any of the trauma, any of the adjunct findings. It can go on forever and ever. If you're talking about a case that involves fiber evidence, or it's a rape, for instance, a sexual assault case, you're trimming nails, you're doing nail scrapings, you're doing rape kits, all that stuff. So every case is going to be a little bit different. But when you're talking about an examination of the President of the United States, it would behoove you to really take your time and be set up and listen. And here's the big thing. It is about what you're doing at that moment in time, but it's what you're going to have to do afterwards. Mm. You're going to have to stand and deliver. You're going to have to explain why you did this, and this. And for some reason, there seemed to be a lack of awareness of that, because if that were the case, again, I bring it back to this. You would have had a board-certified forensic pathologist, probably 2 or 3, that would have been there in order to make note of everything that was happening, and they would question one another. Now, why are you doing this? And that's the thing about forensic pathologists. They love to argue with one another, and that's good. It's good in an academic sense and a scientific sense, because you're keeping one another in check. Can you explain why you're doing this? What's your rationale for doing this? Are you going to make note of this? And of course, the truest thing that you're ever going to see that will emerge out of an autopsy are going to be the pathologist's notes, everything that they're doing. And many times, and this is how I actually started out in the morgue, working in the morgue. I worked as a scribe. And so this is my first taste of being in a morgue. So I would sit dressed out in a scrub suit, and the pathologist would give me organ weights, and I'd write them down. Had a form that was like this. But when it came to their measurements, and generally with gunshot wounds, you've got tons of measurements, because you have to measure from various anatomical landmarks. Like if you're trying to center and give specific location of an insult to a body, you almost want to triangulate it. Like from the apex of the right shoulder, let's say it's mid-sternum, you're going to do it from the sternoclavicular notch that's right here to here, from the apex of the shoulder to here, maybe from the pubis to here. That way I've got it triangulated. I can go back and at any point in time say that's where that gunshot wound was, or the defect was. You don't have that kind of detail in this autopsy report. As a matter of fact, going back to notes, Dr. Hume's burned his autopsy notes.
He burned them.
Yeah.
Did he say why he did that?
According to what he stated, they were covered with the president's blood.
That's right. I saw that in Oliver Stone's documentary. So he burned them because they were covered with the president's blood. And yet he's a guy whose life has been around blood. And I'm suddenly supposed to believe that this one gave him PTSD?
Yeah, that's the thing about it. Let me give you, for instance, from a forensic standpoint. Every notebook that I ever made scene notes in is subject to be subpoenaed. Everything. Mm-hmm. It's not just like when, let's say I go out to a scene, after I've worked a case, I've examined a body at a scene, I go back and I type up an official report that's on the letterhead. It's got the case number. Everything's very neat. And you can see any of these online. Matter of fact, you ever want to see a great forensic scene report from a coroner investigator, look up Robin Williams' death investigation. It's one of the most fantastic reports you'll ever see in your life. Oh, yeah. One of the most thorough. I don't know. Maybe because of the celebrity involved. I have no idea, but I know that investigator did a fantastic job.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, what makes you think, what about that report really like stood out to you?
Because it went into such great detail with everything that was in that environment. Now, a lot of that stuff's redacted, but you can just tell kind of the rattle and hum of how it's written. That investigator that wrote that report has still got his notes.
Yeah.
Okay. And as a matter of fact, you can be subject to penalty if you get rid of your notes. Certainly police officers can, because defense has a right to be able to read your notes, because these are kind of spontaneous comments that you're making. Some people think that it's the best representation of what you're seeing at that moment in time, because you're writing it down as you're, it's kind of translating from what you're visualizing here, what's coming out of the end of that pen. Okay.
Yeah. Isn't this like part of HIPAA? Like the other side of it? Maybe I have the wrong one because I'm not a doctor, but like you are literally, the patient has a right. The family of the patient or the estate has a right to view medical records.
To view these things. Yeah. And HIPAA as it is today, I have no idea what the status of that sort of thing was back then, but it's just good practice. And, the rationale that he gave was that he didn't want it to become some kind of morbid curiosity. I think that's the least of your concerns when it comes to the murder of a president.
Yeah, that's on video too. Goddamn, this case is a mess. It's just so crazy how many holes exist in it to this day, and part of it is because there is the veil of secrecy that's over it. I mean, we've been jumping around on this because your analysis today has been unbelievable, just on all the anatomical parts of this and how this goes, but also the fact that you've been there as a guy who's a huge part of your job was quite literally being on the scenes of these things and putting together what happened and why. Like the detectives are doing that, but you're assisting them with where the blood goes, what this could have meant, like why this could have gone down as a result of where things are. And like today, obviously, that crime scene got cleaned up and it's not there, but we have video to review of it happening, and you can go back to that spot and move around the angles and see, okay, if that bullet came there, then it had to come from there or whatever. Or if the head goes like that, that means the bullet's coming. Oh, am I standing on the spot where that one comes from? And yet we're still at a point where technically the government's public opinion of this assassination technically still is the Warren Commission report.
Yeah, and that's to say that it's a real shame is an understatement. And I just wanted to, anybody wants to look this up, they can. But I wanted to kind of show you what, in my mind at least, sums the whole thing up to me. There's an image here, and it's quite tragic.
Can I see this?
It's quite tragic.
I'll hold it up to the screen here as well. Go ahead. We'll put this in the corner of the screen. We'll get a picture of it too.
Yeah, that's actually an image of a Secret Service agent with a metal bucket outside of the limo, cleaning the interior up of the vehicle, washing it down, and what's really interesting.
When is this?
That's at Parkland. That's in the
like a few hours later.
Yeah, well, you say few. I think it was very quick because they loaded the car up and sent it back. It went back separate from the president's body. I think like the equivalent of an Air Force cargo plane took it back. It may have been a C-130. I'm not really sure. But that kind of sums everything up right there. And what's really interesting, Julian, is when you take a look at that image, there is a Dallas policeman. And he appears to be a motor cop. He's standing there watching this happen before him. as the Secret Service agent cleans up the interior of the car. And it's almost as if he's either standing there in disbelief. There's several police officers around there, and there's even one turned out. And I find this fascinating. It's almost like they've set up a perimeter to facilitate the cleaning of the vehicle instead of the preservation of the evidence. And they're completely cleaning this thing up. And one other thing that you can see clearly demonstrated in this image is that the bubble top has been put back on in this image. Remember, he's riding along in it, and it's not there. And, according to lore, the president wanted the thing off so that he could make contact. Dallas was a critical area. Texas was a critical area for the campaign. He wanted to, he didn't want to be seen as something that's off, an untouchable person. But, you see this and you think, well, the dynamics of that event are what happened. This is the essence of the interior that is left behind, those remnants that are left behind, whether it was bone fragments, blood, distribution of blood, brain matter.
We'll put this one in the corner of the screen as well. Image I'm looking at right now.
Anywhere in there. And I think you've got there are some flowers there perhaps that Jackie had left behind. That's prior to it being cleaned.
This is in a dark room right here? Or?
I'm not really sure the context of it. Right. But you can obviously see what appears to be blood, at least.
Because I'm just saying, the image you just showed me of them cleaning it not
fully
long after
illuminated.
Is outside.
Yeah.
This, now it's black and white and from above. This does not appear to be illuminated. I don't know if it's a shitty camera from 1963, but,
But when you think about the environment and what we saw evidenced in the Zapruder film, the dynamics of that head wound, there's a reason why, we study the dynamics of blood now. Some people say for good, some people say for bad. Some people don't think that it's actual science. I think that it certainly has a lot of utility, but you can appreciate the devastation that goes on in here. And certainly, and here's another thing that is compromised within this environment. If you begin to put elbow grease to it and water and a steel bucket to collect everything that you're doing, you begin to think about, well, what are you removing from this environment? Are you removing a projectile? Is there some bone fragment that's in there? Is there a fragment of a bullet that is in there? Because no one has had an opportunity to closely examine this vehicle at this point in time. I'm reminded of several cases in my past. I think probably even if you think about, for instance, the Coburger case out in Idaho with the murdered college students, you think about that case, well, they've got his car. And can you imagine what they've done to his car? That car has been disassembled by the FBI. Every inch of it has been gone through, documented either, it's been documented probably from a sketch standpoint, notes, certainly photography, maybe even alternative lighting, all those things that have come into play documenting that physical space that they think he occupied during those horrific crimes, or when he was allegedly fleeing or going to them to commit them, allegedly. You look at this and you consider this environment where it's kind of like when I went to Ford's Theater and I saw Abraham Lincoln's rocker that he was seated in. History took place in that location. I'm not saying this should be taken out and memorialized, this seat, which this horror took place in, but this is part of our history. And for that moment in time, they didn't, for whatever reason, see a need to preserve it for whatever reason. And I think that's a very sad commentary.
If we're going to talk about the incompetence of the chain of command afterwards, the blatant seeming organized cover-up as well that is happening simultaneously with some of the incompetence that maybe is built in, maybe isn't. But, you know, it's kind of offensive because I hear you say that, and then a few minutes before you show me a picture of some asshole cleaning out with a bucket.
Yeah.
And it's like, what part of you thinks that, forget that it's a crime scene. Forget that. That's common sense right there. That's
hold what you're saying for a second.
Okay.
This is a law enforcement officer doing
Yes.
this too. Okay, go
Exactly.
ahead. I just wanted to
Literally.
yeah.
With a law enforcement, and so, okay, even if the Secret Service guy isn't on a homicide case all the time because he's Secret Service,
Right.
there's cops standing right there who are on this every single day.
Right.
And they're letting this, like, it just, I know people are stupid. I know there's dumb people out there.
Mm-hmm.
The chances of there being this many dumb people, it's not possible.
Yeah, and to get a collection of them in one concentric area at one time.
God damn it, Texas.
At such a cataclysmic moment. Yeah, if you want to hear another good one, I wrote an article a few years ago, or was asked to comment, when Justice Scalia died out in Texas, and
did he not die? Was it?
No. I'm not picking on Texas here, because I got to tell you, one of the finest forensic institutions in the nation is located in Dallas. That's the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Science, and they handle all of the autopsies for the city of Dallas and all of that area, but you might not know this little piece of history about Texas. Texas traditionally does not have coroners. And still in the rural areas, it works this way. The justice of the peace is actually the coroner, or the de facto coroner. Yeah. So when Justice Scalia died, he was out at that hunting lodge.
Like duck shooting or something.
Out in the West Texas, yeah. Justice Scalia had, he had some physical issues.
He was fat.
Heart problems and all that sort of thing. Yeah. Did you know that Justice Scalia was actually pronounced dead over the phone?
Come on.
Mm-hmm. I'll never forget it, because the Justice of the Peace, her name was actually Cinderella. That'll always stick in my brain. And her excuse or rationale for not having pronounced in person, it was too far away. And I'm thinking, so you've got, arguably, let's face it, what is it that they say? Presidents come and go, justices remain forever. And so you've got this man that actually passes away. And yeah, he had U.S. Marshal security and all that sort of thing. And I'm sure that it was a natural death. But that, you look at that and you think, okay, so he's not going to be examined by anyone. And I think a private physician,
No need. Don't worry.
So yeah, I found that kind of interesting, at least tangentially, to our discussion today. That happened out in West Texas, and yeah, I'll never forget that. When I was asked to comment on that years ago, I was surprised, to say the very least, because that's kind of what I used to do: create curriculum for coroners and train coroners. And one of the things we used to train everybody to do is that you go out to scenes and you examine bodies. And the county's paying for your gas. They probably give you a car. It doesn't take too much to go out and snap a couple of pictures and do an examination. And because, the thing about it is, as soon as you don't, you will be populated by a group of people with tinfoil hats. Mm-hmm. And those questions, if they're not asked at that moment in time, they'll always be nipping at your heels. And even if you do go through all of the steps, they'll still be nipping at your heels. But why create more grief in your life? Go out and document it at that point in time. So that brings us back to, among a myriad of things, just the limo itself. When you think about how little care was taken with this, from today's perspective, that car, first off, would have been locked down immediately at Parkland. It would have been removed some way from that location you would have had this thing taken somewhere so that it could be thoroughly examined under perfect lighting conditions, photographed. If there are any projectile holes in the vehicle, you've seen us do trajectory rods and lasers and all that stuff. That would all be done. Anything that was noted in the course of that examination, you would have to be able to document it and try to explain it or try to make sense of it. And it would be, of course, up to a jury to make heads or tails of it as it applies to physical evidence in a future trial. But we'll never have that opportunity, will we? Because it wasn't done. It wasn't done. That car actually was sent away. It was stripped. I think that it was utilized in the future after it had been retooled. And
it was used again, and come on.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that it was completely broken down, repainted, refurnished, refurbished, and it was put back into service, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
For who?
Maybe Johnson. I have no idea.
That I've never heard that before. That is, just when you think it can't get worse, it does.
Yeah, there was actually a defect in the windshield as well, and they saved the windshield. Again,
Nice
back to my comment on the passing through an intermediate target. What created the defect in the windshield? I don't know. Internal versus external beveling.
Yeah.
Do we have a good explanation for that? Where's that windshield today? You can go on and on and on with all of the potholes that this thing is, or let's don't say pot. That's an insult to potholes, landmines that this thing is populated by over and over and over again. You see evidence of this throughout, and again, it brings us back to this construct of, are you intentionally doing this, or are you just this blatantly incompetent? I don't know that there are any other choices.
Well, we've been jumping around a bunch today, which is fine because the analysis has been incredible. And it's impossible not to with this case because there's something that comes up every single step, something out of place. But going back to the scene, you gave a pretty amazing breakdown of from the school book repository and that bullet and the actual pathway of the car and stuff, and we've at least touched on the grassy knoll. You talked about the train yard right there and how easy it would be to get a shot off, hide the bullet, all that. With the 3 shots total, though. All right, guys, that takes us to the end of this part of my sit down with Joseph Scott Morgan. We do have another hour and change left. I've learned the hard way before that when I put out content that's too long, the algorithm does not send it anywhere, and I'm really doing a disservice to guests because they don't get as much reach as they possibly could. So I'd love to put this all out as one, but I couldn't. So you will be getting the last part over the next couple days. Thank you for your patience with that. Hope you've enjoyed so far. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and smash that notifications bell so that you find out exactly when it drops, and hit that like button on the video as well. See you guys soon.